Gideon Hayes never imagined his gun hand would learn to cradle. But there he was, a lone drifter racing across the New Mexico wasteland with two dying infants in his arms, their mother's blood still wet on his coat. Behind him, vultures circled the massacre. Ahead, only desert and doubt. He had 3 days to find help, or these babies would become two more graves in a land already thick with them. This is the story of how mercy broke a man's solitude and rebuilt his soul. Stay with me until the end and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story of hope and redemption can travel across the world. The sun was bleeding out over the New Mexico territory when Gideon Hayes first heard the silence. Not the comfortable quiet of open country. No, this was the terrible hush that follows violence, the kind of silence that makes a man's instincts scream even before his mind catches up. Gideon reined in his mare, Delilah, atop a rocky ridge and squinted through the copper light at the scene below. Even from a quarter-mile distance, he could read the story written in smoke and scattered timber. Wagon train. Attacked. Recently. His weathered hand moved instinctively to the Colt .45 at his hip, fingers brushing the worn grip like a man checking his own heartbeat. 37 years old, and Gideon Hayes had seen enough death to know its signature from a distance. The way the buzzard circled, lazy, patient, already feeding, told him he was too late to save anyone. "Easy, girl," he murmured to Delilah, though the words were as much for himself as for the horse. Every fiber of his being told him to ride on. Nothing down there but sorrow and probably trouble. In his years drifting from Kansas to California and back again, he'd learned the hard truth that getting involved rarely ended well for a man trying to keep his own skin intact. But something held him there on that ridge. Maybe it was the way the last rays of sunlight caught on what looked like a child's doll lying in the dirt. Maybe it was the memory of his younger sister, dead of cholera 20 years back, her own rag doll clutched in small, still hands. Or maybe it was just that even a man who'd spent the better part of a decade trying to become stone couldn't quite kill the human part of himself that responded to tragedy. Gideon clicked his tongue and nudged Delilah down the slope. The descent took 10 minutes, and with each step closer, the scene revealed itself in increasingly brutal detail. 4 wagons, their canvas tops shredded and burned, oxen dead in their yokes. Personal belongings scattered like seeds across blood-darkened earth, a broken mirror, a family Bible with its pages fluttering in the hot wind, a coffee pot with a bullet hole through its side. And bodies. 8 that he could see, maybe more. Gideon dismounted slowly, his hand never leaving his weapon. Apache, most likely, though it could have been Comanche or just desperate white men dressed to look like Indians. He'd seen all varieties of predator in this country. The attackers had been thorough. This wasn't a raid for supplies or horses. This was slaughter, plain and vicious. He moved through the wreckage with the cautious step of a man who'd survived by expecting ambush. His boots crunched on broken glass. Flies were already thick in the air, their drone a soundtrack to hell. The dead were mostly men, killed quick by arrows or bullets. 2 women lay near the lead wagon, one with gray hair spread like a fan in the dust. The other younger, maybe 25, her arms stretched forward as if she'd been reaching for something when she died. Gideon's jaw tightened. He'd seen worse, had been forced to commit worse once during the war, but that didn't make it sit any easier in his gut. He was turning away, ready to mount up and ride hard for the nearest settlement to report the massacre, when he heard it. A whimper. Soft, muffled, barely human. Gideon froze, every sense suddenly sharp. His hand drew the Colt in one smooth motion, the hammer clicking back as his eyes scanned the carnage. Another sound, a tiny, desperate cry, like a wounded animal. It was coming from beneath the young woman's body. "Christ Almighty," Gideon breathed, holstering his weapon and dropping to his knees beside her. The woman's dress was soaked with blood, her face turned toward the earth. He placed a hand on her shoulder, already cooling, and carefully, respectfully, rolled her onto her back. 2 faces stared up at him from the shadows beneath her body. Infants. Twins, by the look of them, no more than a few months old. A boy and a girl, wrapped in a single blanket now stained with their mother's blood. The girl's mouth was open in a silent wail, her face red with effort and hunger and fear. The boy just stared, his dark eyes fixed on Gideon's face with an intensity that seemed impossible for something so small. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Gideon whispered, his voice rough as creek gravel. The mother had used her body as a shield, died protecting them, covering them so completely that the raiders must have missed them in their hurry. How long had these babies been lying here, trapped beneath their dead mother? Hours, certainly. Maybe since dawn, pinned under her weight in the crushing heat with nothing but her corpse for shade. The girl found her voice fully and let loose a cry that could have shattered glass. Gideon's hands hovered uncertainly over the infants. He was a man who could field strip a rifle blindfolded, who could track a man across bare rock, who could draw and fire in under a second. But babies? He'd never even held one, not in all his years. His own childhood had been too hard, too quick, and he'd spent his adult life deliberately avoiding the kinds of entanglements that led to families. "All right," he said, as if the sound of his own voice could give him courage. "All right, let's get you out of there." He slipped his hands under the girl first. She was the one crying, seemed to need the help most urgently. His fingers felt huge and clumsy as he lifted her, terrified he'd drop her, or hold her wrong, or break something. She weighed almost nothing, felt as fragile as bird bones wrapped in warm cloth. The moment she was free, her crying intensified, her tiny fists pumping the air. "I know, little bit, I know." Gideon laid her gently in the crook of his left arm and reached back for the boy. This one came easier, already adapting to the motion. The boy didn't cry, just kept staring with those unnervingly aware eyes. Gideon stood slowly, both babies cradled against his chest, and looked around the massacre site with new eyes. What was he supposed to do now? He couldn't leave them, even he wasn't that much of a bastard. But he also couldn't care for infants. He had no supplies for them, no knowledge of their needs beyond the basic fact that babies required food and warmth and a gentleness that had been beaten out of him years ago. The smart play was to wrap them up, ride hard for the nearest town, and hand them over to someone equipped to deal with them. There was a settlement called Bitter Creek about 2 days south. They'd have women there, maybe even families who'd lost children and might want to take these two in. 2 days. Could babies survive 2 days with him? The girl's crying had subsided to hiccuping sobs. The boy just watched him, still silent, as if waiting to see what this strange man would do. "Your mama was brave," Gideon told them quietly, looking down at the woman who'd saved them. "Real brave. She died protecting you. And I'll be damned if I let that sacrifice mean nothing." He began to move through the wreckage with purpose now, searching for anything that might help. Found a mostly intact crate that had contained tinned goods. The tins were gone, taken by the raiders, but underneath he discovered 3 glass baby bottles, miraculously unbroken. Near another wagon he found a small trunk, and inside it, swaddling clothes and tiny gowns and a leather bag that contained what looked like dried milk powder. "Thank you, Lord," Gideon muttered, gathering the supplies. His arms were full of babies and gear when he heard hoofbeats. 3 riders approaching from the east at a hard gallop. Gideon's blood went cold. The raiders, coming back? Or maybe they'd never left, just been watching from the ridgeline to see if anyone came to investigate. He had maybe 2 minutes before they reached him. Not enough time to mount and flee with 2 infants, not nearly enough time to prepare a defense. He did the only thing he could think of, carried the babies and his meager supplies to a partially collapsed wagon, and crawled inside the wreckage with them, pulling canvas and broken boards around them until they were hidden in shadows. He settled both babies in his lap, one hand free to draw his weapon, the other pressed gently over the girl's mouth in case she decided to cry again. "Not a sound," he breathed. "Please, little bits, not a sound." The hoofbeats grew louder, then stopped. Gideon heard boots hitting the ground, the creak of leather, men's voices low and wary. "Looks like we got ourselves a visitor, boys." "See them tracks? Fresh as morning dew. Someone was here real recent." "Maybe still is. Fan out, check the wagons." Gideon's heart hammered against his ribs. 3 men, maybe 4 from the sound of it. All armed, all comfortable enough with the massacre site to suggest they'd either done the killing or were friendly with those who had. Through a gap in the broken wagon boards, he could see boots moving, kicking at debris, searching. The girl squirmed in his arms. He could feel her little mouth working against his palm, preparing for another wail. The boy remained eerily quiet, those dark eyes fixed on Gideon's face as if understanding the gravity of their situation. "Please," Gideon mouthed silently. "Please don't cry." One of the men was getting closer. Gideon could hear his breathing, could smell tobacco smoke and old sweat. The man kicked at a piece of the wagon just inches from where they hid. "Got something here," another voice called from across the camp. "Saddlebags, good leather too. And looky here, flask of whiskey, barely touched." The boots near Gideon's hiding spot paused, then turned away. "That'll do for now. Sun's getting low, and I don't fancy spending the night with corpses. Let's take what we can carry and ride. What about whoever made them fresh tracks? Probably saw us coming and ran like a rabbit. If they're smart, they'll keep running." More sounds of movement, horses being loaded with plundered goods, then the blessed noise of riders mounting up and moving off. Gideon stayed frozen for another 10 minutes, barely breathing, until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely into the desert evening. Only then did he remove his hand from the girl's mouth. She immediately began to cry again, and this time Gideon let her. Let both babies fill the dying light with their wails because it meant they were alive, meant he'd kept them safe one more hour. He crawled out of the wreckage with them, gathered his supplies, and walked to where Delilah waited patiently, her reins trailing. "Change of plans, girl," he told the mare as he figured out how to strap one baby to his chest using a torn length of cotton from a woman's dress, fashioning a crude sling that pressed the boy against his heartbeat. The girl he settled into a leather saddlebag, cushioning her with soft clothes and leaving the flap open so she could breathe. It wasn't ideal. Nothing about this situation was, but it would have to do. The sun touched the horizon as Gideon mounted up, hyper-aware of the precious, fragile cargo he carried. He couldn't go to Bitter Creek anymore. Those riders were headed south, and he wouldn't risk crossing their path again with 2 infants in tow. North, then, toward the territories where he knew the land better, where he could find shelter and safety. It would be a harder journey, longer, through rougher country. But Gideon Hayes had survived worse odds. "Hang on, little bits," he murmured, nudging Delilah into a careful walk. "We got us a long night ahead." Day 1. The Night Ride. The desert night came down like a curtain, and with it, a cold that seemed impossible after the day's scorching heat. Gideon kept Delilah to a steady walk, following game trails and dry creek beds northward, always listening for sounds of pursuit that never came. The babies cried. God, how they cried. The girl in the saddlebag wailed on and off for the first 3 hours, her voice hoarse with thirst and hunger and the deep primal fear of abandonment. Each cry went through Gideon like a knife. The boy, pressed against his chest, remained quieter but restless, squirming and making small, distressed sounds that were somehow worse than his sister's outright screams. Around midnight, Gideon stopped by a seep spring, barely more than wet rocks, really, and tried to figure out how to mix the dried milk powder. He had no fire, didn't dare risk the light, so he worked by moonlight with cold water and shaking hands, measuring powder into one of the bottles and shaking until it mostly dissolved. The girl latched onto the bottle nipple with desperate strength, sucking so hard he worried she'd choke. She drained half the bottle before pausing to breathe, milk running down her chin. The boy took his feeding more delicately, his eyes never leaving Gideon's face even as he drank. "You're the quiet one, aren't you?" Gideon said softly, watching the infant. "Your sister does all the talking for both of you." When both babies had eaten, Gideon changed their soiled cloths, a process that left him grimacing and gagging, and wrapped them in clean swaddling. Then he sat with his back against a boulder, both babies cradled in his arms, and tried to decide what the hell he'd gotten himself into. He should have left them. That was the cold truth. A man with any sense would have ridden straight past that wagon train, let someone else discover the survivors. He was no nursemaid, no family man. He'd spent 15 years cultivating the ability to walk away from trouble, to avoid the kind of emotional attachments that got you killed, or, worse, got others killed on your account. But when the girl made a small, contented sound and curled her tiny fist into his shirt, Gideon felt something crack in the careful armor he'd built around his heart. "Your mama called you Ruth," he whispered, looking down at her. "Heard her saying it, right before she passed. And you? He shifted his gaze to the boy. You're Eli. Those are good names, strong names. The babies slept fitly, waking every hour or so with cries that Gideon soothed as best he could, rocking them, walking them, humming half-remembered songs from his own childhood. By the time dawn broke over the eastern hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Gideon had gotten maybe an hour of sleep total. His eyes were gritty with exhaustion, his body stiff from sitting in one position too long, and both babies had spit up on him at least twice. He smelled like milk and infant waste and old sweat. And yet, when Ruth opened her eyes and looked up at him with something that might have been trust, Gideon felt a fierce protectiveness surge through him that rivaled anything he'd felt in battle. All right, little bits, he said, standing and settling them back into their traveling arrangements. Let's put some miles behind us. Quote, Day 2. The Canyon. The second day was harder. The babies were more distressed, crying longer and more frequently. Gideon's milk powder supply was running low. He'd need to find a ranch or settlement soon, or figure out some alternative. Goat's milk, maybe, if he could find a wild herd. The problem was, he was riding through some of the most desolate country in the territory, broken mesas and deep canyons where water was scarce and people even scarcer. By midday, with the sun beating down like a hammer and both babies screaming themselves hoarse, Gideon was approaching the edge of his endurance. His canteen was nearly empty, Delilah was flagging, and he had no clear destination in mind, just a vague notion that if he kept heading north, he'd eventually hit the territorial road that ran between Santa Fe and Albuquerque. Eventually wasn't good enough for two dying babies. He was following a narrow canyon, its red rock walls rising 50 feet on either side, when Delilah suddenly balked, ears pinned back. Gideon's hand went to his gun even as he scanned the canyon ahead. Nothing visible, but Delilah had good instincts. If she sensed danger, the rattlesnake struck from a crevice in the rock wall, its fangs sinking into Delilah's foreleg. The mare screamed and reared. Gideon had a split second to secure the babies before he was thrown, hitting the ground hard enough to see stars. He rolled instinctively, covering Eli with his body, aware of Ruth's terrified shrieks from the saddlebag that had fallen nearby. Delilah was panicking, kicking and bucking, foam flying from her mouth. The snake, a big diamondback, 4 feet if it was an inch, had retreated back into the rocks, its rattle a malicious buzz that echoed off the canyon walls. "Whoa! Easy, girl!" Gideon shouted, but the horse was beyond hearing. She galloped 30 yards up the canyon before her legs gave out and she crashed to the ground, sides heaving. Gideon ran to Ruth first, scooping up the saddlebag and checking her frantically for injuries. She was screaming but unharmed, just terrified. He pressed her against his chest next to Eli and hurried to where Delilah lay dying. The bite was bad, right on the foreleg where the venom would spread fast. The mare's eyes were already glazing, her breathing labored. Gideon knelt beside her, one hand on her neck, feeling her pulse flutter and fade. "I'm sorry, girl," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." Delilah gave one last shuddering breath and went still. For a long moment, Gideon just knelt there in the dirt, 2 screaming babies in his arms, his dead horse beside him, and the full weight of his situation crushing down on his shoulders. No horse, low on supplies. In the middle of a canyon with high walls and only 2 directions to go. Miles from anywhere, with 2 infants who needed care he couldn't provide. This was how it would end, he realized with crystalline clarity. Not in a gunfight like he'd always figured, not with a bullet or a knife, but here, in this nameless canyon, trying to save 2 children he didn't even know. Ruth's cries were weakening, becoming hoarse whispers. Eli had stopped making any sound at all, just lay limply against Gideon's chest. They were dehydrating fast in the brutal heat, and he had maybe a few swallows of water left. "No," Gideon said aloud, his voice hard. "No, damn it, not like this." He stood, legs shaking, and began to salvage what he could from Delilah's body. The saddle was too heavy to carry, but he took the saddlebags with the few supplies he had left. Fashioned a better sling for both babies using strips of leather, binding them against his chest and back so his hands would be free. Took one last swallow of water himself, then used the rest to wet a cloth and let the babies suck on it. Then he started walking. The canyon floor was rocky and uneven, the sun a merciless eye above. Gideon had no idea how far the canyon stretched, only knew that staying still meant death. So he walked, one foot in front of the other, while Ruth whimpered against his chest and Eli's labored breathing warmed his back. An hour passed. Then 2. His throat was dust. His legs felt like they belonged to someone else. The babies had gone silent, not sleeping, just too weak to cry anymore. That scared him more than anything. He was starting to hallucinate, seeing water where there was none, hearing voices on the wind when he rounded a bend and saw it. Green, real green, not a fever dream. Trees and grass and the unmistakable glint of running water. A stream cut across the canyon floor ahead, fed by some spring higher up in the rocks. Desert willows grew along its banks, creating pockets of shade. It was the most beautiful thing Gideon had ever seen. He fell to his knees beside the water and scooped handfuls into his mouth, drinking until his stomach cramped. Then he wet his hands and carefully, so carefully, dripped water onto the baby's lips. Ruth's mouth opened reflexively. Eli's eyes fluttered. "That's it," Gideon croaked. "Come on, little bits. Come back." He spent the next hour just sitting in the shade, letting the babies recover, feeding them more water mixed with the last of the milk powder. The relief of finding water had given him new strength, but he knew they weren't out of danger yet. They needed real help, a doctor, a town, someone who actually knew how to care for infants. As the sun began its descent, painting the canyon walls in amber light, Gideon heard something that made his heart leap. The distant sound of a wagon. Wheels creaking, a horse's hoofbeats, coming from farther up the canyon. He rose carefully, settling the babies, and moved toward the sound. Around another bend, he saw it. A small covered wagon, old but well-maintained, pulled by a single draft horse. And driving it, a woman in a dusty calico dress and a wide-brimmed hat. For a moment, Gideon just stood there, afraid she was another hallucination. Then the woman saw him, her eyes widen, taking in his battered appearance, the 2 infants strapped to him, the desperate exhaustion written on every line of his face. She pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down quickly, moving toward him with the careful approach one might use with a wounded animal. "Sir?" Her voice was clear and calm, touched with a soft drawl that suggested she was from somewhere farther east. "Sir, are you hurt?" "The babies," Gideon managed, his voice cracked on the words. "They need help. Their mama... wagon train massacre. I've been trying to keep them alive, but I can't." The woman was already reaching for Ruth, her hands practiced and gentle as she lifted the infant from the sling. She laid the baby against her shoulder and began examining her with quick efficiency, checking her color, her breathing, the moistness of her mouth. "This one's dehydrated but alive," she said. "What about the other?" Gideon turned so she could see Eli on his back. The woman moved around him and performed the same assessment, her face grave but not panicked. "They both need fluids, proper food, and rest. How long have you been on your own with them?" 2 days. Found them under their mother's body. Everyone else was dead." The words were tumbling out now, a dam breaking. "I've been trying to get north, find help, but my horse got bit by a rattler and died. And I don't know what I'm doing with babies. I've never even held one before 2 days ago." The woman met his eyes, and in hers he saw something he hadn't expected. Respect. "You've done well," she said simply. "Better than most men would. These children are alive because of you." She made a decision, straightening her shoulders. "My name is Margaret Wynne. I'm a midwife, bound for Sweetwater Creek. It's about 4 days north by wagon. You and these babies are coming with me." Gideon wanted to argue, to maintain some shred of the independence he'd guarded so fiercely for so many years. But Ruth chose that moment to let out a weak cry, and Eli's breathing hitched, and he realized he was simply too tired, too grateful, to resist. "Gideon Hayes," he said by way of introduction. "And this is Ruth and Eli. I don't know their family name. Their mama died before she could tell me much." "Then they're Ruth and Eli Hayes, for now," Margaret said firmly. "Until we learn different. Come on, Mr. Hayes. Let's get these children fed and settled. You look like you're about to fall over." She wasn't wrong. Now that help had arrived, all the adrenaline and desperate determination that had kept Gideon moving for 2 days was draining away like water through cupped hands. He let Margaret guide him to the wagon, helped her settle the babies on a pile of soft blankets inside, and watched with dim amazement as she produced proper feeding bottles and real goat's milk from her supplies. "I travel prepared," Margaret said, seeing his expression. "In my line of work, you never know when you'll come across someone in need." She began heating milk over a small portable stove. "Now sit down before you fall down, Mr. Hayes, and tell me the full story while these bottles warm." So Gideon sat, his back against a wagon wheel, and told her everything. The massacre site, finding the babies, the raiders who'd almost discovered them, the long nights of crying and feeding and not knowing what he was doing, the snake, the canyon, the desperate walk with 2 dying infants. Margaret listened without interrupting, her hands busy with the practical work of preparing bottles and warming water. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You saved their lives," she finally said, "twice over, by my count. Once when you chose not to ride past that wagon train, and again when you didn't give up in that canyon." She handed him a bottle of milk. "Here, you feed Eli, that's the boy, yes? And I'll take Ruth. They respond to you, I can see it. They trust you." Gideon took the bottle with hands that shook slightly. Eli's eyes opened as Gideon cradled him, and the infant's small mouth found the nipple immediately, sucking with more strength than he'd shown in hours. Watching the baby drink, feeling him grow less rigid with relief and satisfaction, Gideon felt that crack in his armor widen a little more. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with them," he admitted quietly. "Long term, I mean. I'm no family man, Miss Wynne. I'm a drifter. Have been for 15 years since the war ended. I don't have a home, don't have prospects. Hell, until 2 days ago, I hadn't spoken more than 10 words to another soul in 3 months." "And yet here you are," Margaret said, her tone gentle but firm, "with 2 babies who are alive because you couldn't walk away." She paused in her feeding of Ruth to look at him directly. "What you're supposed to do, Mr. Hayes, is exactly what you've been doing. Keep them alive, keep them safe. The rest, we'll figure it out when we get to Sweetwater." "Sweetwater got families who might want them?" "Maybe. It's a good town, growing steady. There are folks there with kind hearts." She hesitated. "But I'll be honest with you. Winter's coming on fast, and times are hard. 2 orphans with no kin and no resources, it won't be easy to place them." Gideon looked down at Eli, who had finished his bottle and was regarding Gideon with those solemn dark eyes. Ruth had fallen asleep in Margaret's arms, her small face finally peaceful. In 2 days, these tiny strangers had become what? His responsibility, certainly. But more than that. Something he didn't have words for, something that made his chest feel tight and his throat close up. "Well," he said roughly, "we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. For now, let's just get them to Sweetwater in one piece." Margaret smiled. "That's a good plan, Mr. Hayes." Day 3. The Wagon. They traveled together through the next day and night, the wagon creaking steadily northward along game trails and old prospectors' roads that Margaret seemed to know by heart. She'd been making this circuit for 5 years, she explained, traveling between scattered ranches and small towns to help women birth their babies and tend to their health concerns. "It's lonely work sometimes," she admitted as they rolled through the early morning of the 3rd day, "but needful. Out here, a woman might be 40 miles from the nearest doctor. If she goes into labor with complications, or if a baby comes breech, she needs someone who knows what they're doing." "You ever lose one?" Gideon asked. He was sitting beside her on the wagon bench, holding Ruth while Eli slept in a makeshift cradle Margaret had rigged in the wagon bed. "A mother or a baby?" Margaret's hands tightened on the reins. 3 mothers, 7 babies. In 5 years, that's not a bad record, but each one, as she swallowed hard, each one stays with you. You remember their names, their faces. You wonder if there was something else you could have done. Gideon understood that burden. He carried his own roster of the dead, men he'd killed in the war, men he'd failed to save, the sister who'd died while he was off playing soldier. The weight of it never really left you. You just learned to carry it better. "These 2 are lucky you found us," Gideon said, looking down at Ruth. She'd been fussy all morning, pulling at her ear and whimpering. Margaret had diagnosed an ear infection, treated it with warm oil and willow bark tea, and assured him it would pass. We found each other, Margaret corrected. And lucky works both ways, I think. They fell into an easy rhythm over that third day. Margaret drove while Gideon tended the babies, a reversal of expected roles that neither commented on. He learned to recognize Ruth's different cries: hunger, discomfort, pain, fear. Learned that Eli responded to gentle rocking and low humming, that he watched faces with intense concentration as if memorizing them. Margaret taught him practical skills: how to test milk temperature on his wrist, how to burp a baby properly, how to swaddle tight enough to comfort but loose enough to allow movement. She answered his questions patiently, never making him feel stupid for not knowing things that seemed obvious to her. Most men wouldn't even try, she said when he apologized for the 10th time for his clumsiness. Most men would have handed these babies off to the first woman they saw and rode away without looking back. The fact that you're still here, still learning, still trying, that matters more than you know. As the sun began to set on their third day together, they made camp in a small hollow sheltered by cottonwoods. A seasonal creek ran through it, still holding water from the summer monsoons. While Margaret prepared a simple dinner of salt pork and beans, Gideon bathed the babies carefully in warm water, marveling at how much more confident he felt doing it than he had 3 days ago. Ruth kicked and splashed, seeming to enjoy the water. Eli remained solemn but relaxed, his small body going limp with contentment as Gideon washed him gently. By the time both babies were clean and dressed in fresh gowns, the stars were coming out and Margaret had coffee brewing over the fire. They ate in comfortable silence, the babies sleeping between them wrapped in blankets. The night was cool but not cold, the fire warm, the sound of the creek soothing. For the first time in longer than Gideon could remember, he felt something like peace. "Can I ask you something personal, Mr. Hayes?" Margaret said, refilling their coffee cups. "Gideon, and sure, I guess. What happened? To make you spend 15 years drifting alone?" When he stiffened, she raised a hand quickly. "You don't have to answer. I'm just curious about the man who'd save 2 babies and then claim he's no good with people." Gideon stared into his coffee for a long moment. He didn't talk about the past, had trained himself not to think about it, but something about the firelight and the sleeping babies and this woman who'd shown him nothing but kindness made the words come easier. "I had a family once," he said quietly. "During the war. Got married young, right before I enlisted. My wife Sarah was pregnant when I left. Promised her I'd be back before the baby came." He paused, the old guilt and grief tightening his throat. "I wasn't. Took a bullet at Shiloh, spent 6 months in a hospital tent. By the time I made it home, Sarah had died in childbirth. The baby, a daughter, lived 3 days. Margaret made a soft sound of sympathy but didn't interrupt. My little sister, the one I told you about, died a month after that. Cholera swept through our county. I buried her next to Sarah and the baby." Gideon's hands tightened around his cup. "That was it. Everyone I loved, gone in less than a year. I sold the farm, took what little I could carry, and started riding. Figured if I didn't attach to anybody, didn't let anybody attach to me, I couldn't hurt like that again." "And did it work?" Margaret asked gently. Gideon looked at Ruth and Eli, sleeping peacefully in their blankets, and felt that crack in his armor split wide open. "No," he admitted. "No, it didn't work worth a damn." Margaret reached across the fire and touched his hand briefly. "I'm glad. A man who can't feel pain can't feel joy either. And those babies, they deserve someone who can feel both, who can grieve for their mother and still choose to keep living, keep protecting them." "What about you?" Gideon asked, eager to shift the focus. "How'd you end up doing this? Traveling alone, delivering babies in the middle of nowhere?" Margaret smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "I had a sweetheart once, Robert. We were engaged to be married, had the whole future planned out. He was going to be a doctor. I was going to assist him. We'd have a practice in St. Louis, a house with a garden, children of our own someday." "What happened?" "Typhoid. He died 3 weeks before our wedding." She stirred the fire absently. "I couldn't stay in St. Louis after that. Too many memories, too many what-ifs. So I came west, learned midwifery from an old Mexican woman in Santa Fe, and just kept moving. Helping people seemed like the only thing that made the grief bearable. They sat together in the quiet understanding of two people who'd both loved and lost, both built walls around their hearts, and both found those walls insufficient in the face of two helpless infants who needed them. "We're a fine pair, aren't we?" Gideon said with a dry laugh. "Two broken people trying to keep two innocent lives from breaking the same way." "Maybe that's exactly what they need," Margaret replied. "People who know how much the world can hurt and choose to protect them from it anyway." Ruth stirred then, making a sleepy sound. Gideon reached for her automatically, settled her against his chest, and began rocking gently. She sighed and relaxed, her small fist curling into his shirt, and he felt something in his chest, that cracked armor, finally shatter completely. He was attached. God help him, he was already attached to these tiny strangers, to their different cries and their small victories and the weight of them in his arms. And standing here on the edge of that attachment was terrifying because he knew how much it could hurt when you lost someone you loved. But looking down at Ruth's peaceful face, feeling Eli's steady breathing where Margaret had laid him across Gideon's lap, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. Whatever came next, whether they found a family in Sweetwater or not, he'd had these few days. He'd been needed, had been useful, had been something other than a ghost drifting through other people's lives. "Thank you," he said to Margaret, his voice rough, "for stopping, for helping, for not making me feel like an idiot for trying." "Thank you," she replied, "for not giving up on them when most men would have. The world needs more of that kind of stubborn mercy." The fire burned low as the night deepened. They took turns sleeping and watching over the babies, and when Gideon woke for his watch in the darkest hours before dawn, he found Margaret had covered him with an extra blanket and left fresh coffee warming by the embers. It was a small kindness, but it lodged in his heart alongside the weight of the babies and the memory of Ruth's tiny fist gripping his shirt. Small kindnesses, he was learning, were the threads that stitched a broken life back together. Not all at once, not completely whole, but enough to keep going, enough to hope. Day 4. The storm clouds. The fourth day dawned gray and heavy, the sky thick with clouds that promised rain. Margaret frowned at the horizon as they packed up camp. "Storm's coming," she said. "A bad one by the look of it. We're still a full day from Sweetwater, maybe more if the roads turn to mud." "There any shelter between here and there?" Gideon asked, settling the babies into the wagon. "There's an old line shack about 10 miles north. Used to be part of the Bar T Ranch before they went bust. It's been abandoned for years, but the roof was still intact last time I passed. We could hole up there, wait out the worst of it." "How bad we talking?" Margaret met his eyes. "Bad enough that traveling with 2 infants in an open wagon would be dangerous. These desert storms can drop the temperature 20 degrees in an hour, and the wind—" She shook her head. "Let's just get to that shack as fast as we can." They made good time at first, the wagon rattling along at a steady pace, but the storm was coming faster than Margaret had anticipated. By noon, the wind had picked up, cold and sharp, carrying the metallic smell of rain. The babies could feel the change in pressure. Both were fussy, crying in turns, inconsolable despite Gideon's best efforts. The first drops of rain hit just as they spotted the line shack in the distance, a small, weathered structure of wood and stone, listing slightly to one side but still standing. Thunder cracked overhead like cannon fire, and suddenly the sky opened up. Rain came down in sheets so heavy Gideon could barely see the horses in front of him. The wagon lurched and slipped in the rapidly forming mud. Margaret fought the reins, trying to keep them on course toward the shack, but the horse was panicking, tossing its head and pulling sideways. "Gideon!" Margaret shouted over the storm. "Take the babies and run! Get them inside! I'll secure the wagon!" He didn't argue, just grabbed both infants, Ruth in one arm, Eli in the other, wrapped them in his coat as best he could, and jumped from the moving wagon. His boots hit mud and he staggered, nearly falling, but kept his feet. Rain lashed his face, soaking through his clothes in seconds. The babies were screaming, terrified by the noise and the cold and the chaos. Gideon ran. The 50 yards to the shack felt like a mile. His boots slipped and slid in the mud. Lightning struck close enough that he could feel the air crackle, could smell ozone burning. Thunder followed immediately, a sound so loud it seemed to split the world in half. But he kept running, kept his arms locked around the babies, kept his body bent over theirs to shield them from the worst of the rain. He hit the shack door at full speed, nearly breaking it off its rusted hinges. Inside was dark and musty but dry. Mostly dry anyway. The roof had some leaks, water dripping in streams from several spots, but the bulk of the structure was sound. Gideon found a corner that seemed driest, laid the babies down on his coat, and immediately began checking them for injuries. They were soaked and cold but unharmed. Their cries had subsided to miserable whimpers. Gideon stripped off their wet clothes with shaking hands, found relatively dry blankets in the wagon supplies he'd had strapped to his back, and wrapped them tightly. "It's okay," he murmured, his own teeth chattering. "We're safe now. We're inside. You're going to be fine." The door burst open and Margaret stumbled in, soaked to the skin, her hair plastered to her face. She was breathing hard, but unhurt. "Horses sheltered on the lee side," she gasped. "Wagons secured. How are they?" "Cold and scared, but okay." Gideon pulled Ruth closer, trying to warm her with his body heat. "We need to get them dry and warm fast, or they'll catch their death." Margaret was already moving, efficient despite her exhaustion. She'd brought more supplies from the wagon, including a small oil lantern that she lit with a waterproof match. The light revealed the shack's interior. One room, maybe 12 feet square, with a potbelly stove in the corner and an old rope bed frame against one wall. There was even a small stack of firewood, ancient and dusty, but dry. "Thank God," Margaret breathed, seeing the wood. Within minutes, she had a fire crackling in the stove, and the tiny space began to warm. They hung wet clothes on a rope strung across the room and gathered around the stove with the babies. For an hour, they just focused on getting everyone warm and dry, fed the babies, changed them, wrapped them in layers of blankets until only their small faces showed. Gradually, Ruth's whimpering stopped. Eli's color improved. They both fell into an exhausted sleep, nestled together in a nest of blankets. Only then did Gideon and Margaret attend to themselves. They were both shivering violently, their lips blue with cold. Margaret handed Gideon a dry shirt from her supplies, too small for him, but better than nothing, and turned her back while he changed. He did the same for her, staring at the wall while she struggled into dry clothes. "That was close," Margaret said once they were both dressed and holding cups of coffee she'd somehow managed to brew. The storm raged outside, wind howling around the shack, rain hammering the roof. But inside, with the fire warming their small space and the babies sleeping safely, it felt almost cozy. "Too close," Gideon agreed. He looked at the babies, his chest tight. "If we'd been 10 minutes slower—" "But we weren't. They're safe. That's what matters." Margaret wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, watching the steam rise. "You know, I've delivered over 100 babies in 5 years, helped dozens of mothers through labor and illness and fear. But I've never seen anything quite like what you've done with these two. I just kept them alive. You're the one who actually knows what she's doing. No, it's more than that. You transformed yourself for them. In 4 days, you went from a man who'd never held a baby to someone who reads their needs before they even cry. That takes more than skill, Gideon. That takes love." The word hung in the air between them, huge and terrifying. Gideon wanted to deny it, to retreat back into his familiar cynicism. But sitting here in a drafty shack during a storm, watching Ruth's small chest rise and fall, feeling the weight of Eli in his arms, he couldn't. "I don't know what happens when we get to Sweetwater," he said quietly. "If someone wants to adopt them, if there's a good family that can give them a real home, I can't stand in the way of that. I've got nothing to offer them. No house, no money, no stability." "You have yourself," Margaret said firmly, "and sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything." She paused, seeming to wrestle with something. "I wasn't going to say this yet, but Gideon, when we reach Sweetwater, I'm staying there for the winter. I have a small house there left to me by a patient who passed. It's not much, but it's warm and dry. You and the babies could stay there too, just until spring, until we figure out what's best for them." Gideon's heart kicked against his ribs. The offer was more than he'd expected, more than he deserved. It was also terrifying, the idea of staying in one place, of committing to something beyond the next day's trail. But before he could answer, Ruth woke with a cry. Not her usual cry. This was different, sharper, edged with pain. Gideon was on his feet immediately, scooping her up. She was burning hot, her small face flushed. "Margaret," he said urgently, "something's wrong." Margaret came quickly, laying a practiced hand on Ruth's forehead. Her expression tightened. "She's got a fever. Could be from the cold, could be that ear infection flaring up, could be something else. We need to bring it down fast." She began issuing instructions, and Gideon followed them precisely. Cool cloths on Ruth's forehead, more willow bark tea, keeping her hydrated, watching for signs of worsening. The night that followed was the longest of Gideon's life, longer than any battle, longer than any bar fight or desperate escape. He and Margaret took turns holding Ruth, walking her, singing to her, doing everything they could to comfort her while her small body fought whatever infection had taken hold. Eli woke periodically, seeming to sense his sister's distress, and Gideon found himself juggling both babies while Margaret prepared medicines and kept the fire stoked. Around 3 a.m, Ruth's fever finally broke. She stopped crying, relaxed in Gideon's arms, and fell into a deep, genuine sleep. Margaret checked her pulse, her breathing, her color, and finally nodded. "She's through the worst of it. The fever's going down. She'll be weak for a few days, but she'll be okay." Gideon sank onto the old bed frame, Ruth cradled against his chest, and realized his own face was wet. He was crying, silent tears running down his cheeks, and he couldn't seem to stop. All the fear and exhaustion and desperate hope of the past 4 days was pouring out of him. Margaret sat beside him and put her hand on his shoulder. She didn't say anything, just sat there while he cried, while the storm outside began to subside, while Ruth slept peacefully, and Eli stirred in his nest of blankets. "I can't lose them," Gideon finally managed. "I know I barely know them. I know I'm not their father, not really, but I can't lose anyone else. Not after Sarah, not after the baby and my sister. I can't." "Then don't," Margaret said simply. "When we get to Sweetwater, when people start asking questions and making suggestions about what's best for these children, you speak up. You tell them that Ruth and Eli already have someone. They have you, and if you want, they have me too. We can do this, Gideon. Together, we can give them a home." He turned to look at her, this strong woman who'd appeared out of nowhere and helped him save 2 lives, who'd taught him how to be gentle, how to care, how to let himself be needed, who was offering not just shelter, but partnership, a chance to build something real. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you do that? You don't know me. I could be anyone, a criminal, a drunk, a man who'd abandon you first chance I got." "But you're not any of those things," Margaret said. "You're a man who saw 2 dying babies and chose mercy over convenience. A man who walked through a desert with snake bites and starvation threatening, who learned to feed and comfort and love them even though it terrified you. That's who you are, Gideon Hayes, and that's enough for me." The first light of dawn was seeping through the gaps in the shack's walls when Ruth opened her eyes and looked up at Gideon. Really looked at him with recognition and something that might have been trust, or might have been love, or might have been both. She made a small sound, not distress, just acknowledgement, and her tiny hand patched his chest. And Gideon Hayes, who'd spent 15 years running from attachment, from pain, from the possibility of loss, made a choice. He looked at Margaret and nodded once. "Okay," he said. "Okay. When we get to Sweetwater, let's give them a home. Together." Margaret smiled, and in that smile was hope and promise, and the beginning of something neither of them had expected to find, a family born not from blood, but from mercy, forged in a desert canyon and sealed in a drafty shack during a storm. Outside, the rain had stopped. The sun was breaking through the clouds, painting the New Mexico sky in shades of gold and rose. And inside the line shack, 4 people who'd been alone were alone no longer. The road to Sweetwater was still a day ahead. Whatever challenges awaited them there, skeptical townsfolk, practical concerns, the weight of responsibility, would come in their time. But for now, in this moment, they had enough. Warm fire, dry shelter, 2 sleeping babies, and each other. It was a start. And sometimes, Gideon was learning, a start was all you needed to begin building a life worth living. The morning sun had fully risen by the time they packed up the line shack, its golden light transforming the muddy landscape into something almost beautiful. Gideon secured the babies in their traveling arrangements while Margaret hitched the horse back to the wagon, both of them moving with the practiced efficiency of people who'd learned to work together without needing many words. Ruth was still weak from her fever, sleeping more than usual, her small body limp and warm against Gideon's chest. Eli seemed to sense his sister's fragility and remained unusually quiet, his dark eyes tracking Gideon's every movement with that uncanny awareness that still unnerved him a little. "She'll need watching," Margaret said as she helped Gideon settle into the wagon. "Keep checking her temperature. If it spikes again, we stop immediately, no matter how close we are to town." "Understood." Gideon adjusted Ruth's blanket, his hand automatically moving to her forehead. Still warm, but not dangerously so. "How far to Sweetwater from here?" "If the roads aren't too torn up from the storm, we should reach it by sunset. It's not a big place, maybe 300 souls, but it's growing. There's a doctor there, Doc Brennan. He's good with children. We'll have him look at Ruth as soon as we arrive." The wagon lurched forward, wheels squelching through mud but finding purchase. They traveled in silence for the first hour, both lost in their own thoughts. Gideon found himself studying the landscape with new eyes, seeing it not as a drifter passing through, but as someone who might actually stay. The mesas and canyons that had always seemed harsh and unforgiving now looked like they could be home, given the right circumstances. "You're thinking awfully hard over there," Margaret observed, glancing at him from the corner of her eye. "Having second thoughts?" "No, just trying to imagine it. Staying somewhere. Being someone's—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Father?" Margaret supplied gently. The word hit him like a physical blow. Father. He'd never expected to hear that word applied to himself again, not after losing his daughter before she'd lived long enough to say it. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it felt different now. Less like a wound that wouldn't heal, and more like a scar, still tender, but survivable. "I don't know if I can be that," he admitted. "What if I mess it up? What if I'm not enough?" "Then you'll mess it up and learn and try again, same as every other parent in the world." Margaret's voice was firm but kind. "Nobody knows what they're doing at first, Gideon. We're all just doing our best and hoping it's enough. The fact that you're worried about being good enough tells me you probably will be." Ruth stirred against his chest, making a small sound of discomfort. Gideon immediately began rocking her gently, humming one of the half-remembered songs from his own childhood. Her breathing evened out, and she settled back into sleep. The exchange took maybe 30 seconds, but when Gideon looked up, Margaret was smiling. "See? You already know what to do. You just don't trust yourself yet." They stopped at midday to rest the horse and feed the babies. Eli took his bottle eagerly, his strength returning with each meal. Ruth managed only a few swallows before falling back asleep, but Margaret assured Gideon that was normal after a fever. They changed the babies, checked their clothes for dampness, and prepared to continue. That's when Gideon spotted the riders. 3 of them, approaching from the east at a casual pace. His hand moved instinctively to his gun, and Margaret caught the movement. "Trouble?" she asked quietly. "Don't know yet, but stay close to the wagon. If I tell you to run, you run." The riders drew closer, and Gideon got a better look. All men, heavily armed, but their postures weren't immediately aggressive. The one in front was older, maybe 50, with a weather-beaten face and a sheriff's star pinned to his vest. The other 2 looked like deputies, younger and harder-edged, but following the older man's lead. "Afternoon," the sheriff called out as they approached, raising one hand in a peaceful gesture. "Name's Tom Carlisle, sheriff out of Sweetwater Creek. This is my territory you're passing through." "Afternoon, Sheriff," Margaret replied, stepping forward. "I'm Margaret Wynn, midwife. This is Gideon Hayes. We're heading for Sweetwater." Sheriff Carlisle's eyes moved from Margaret to Gideon, then down to the babies. His expression shifted, curiosity replacing casual wariness. "Those are mighty young traveling companions you've got there, Mr. Hayes." Gideon felt his spine stiffen defensively, but Margaret touched his arm in warning before he could speak. She was right. Antagonizing the law wouldn't help anything. It's a long story, Sheriff, Gideon said carefully. Found these two at a massacre site 4 days south of here. Their mama died protecting them. Everyone else was dead. I've been trying to get them to safety ever since. The sheriff dismounted and approached slowly, his deputies staying mounted but alert. Up close, Gideon could see that Tom Carlyle had kind eyes, the sort of eyes that had seen too much suffering to add to it unnecessarily. A massacre? Where exactly? Canyon country, near the old Apache trails. Wagon train, 4 wagons. 8 adults dead that I counted, maybe more. Raiders hit them, probably 2 days before I arrived. You see who did it? No, sir. But I did see 3 men come back to the site while I was there. They didn't spot me, but they were comfortable with what they saw. Either they did the killing, or they knew who did. Sheriff Carlyle's mouth tightened into a grim line. We've had reports of a gang working that territory. Call themselves the Red Canyon Boys, though there's nothing boyish about them. Murders and thieves, the lot of them. He looked at the babies again, and something softened in his weathered face. These little ones are lucky you came along when you did. Lucky I didn't ride past, you mean? Gideon adjusted his hold on Ruth, protective. Sheriff, we're heading to Sweetwater to find proper care for them, and maybe families willing to take them in. That going to be a problem? Problem? Hell no. Sweetwater could use some good news for a change. Carlyle turned to his deputies. Billy, ride ahead and tell Doc Brennan we've got a sick infant coming in. And let Mrs. Patterson know. She'll want to help with the children. One of the deputies nodded and spurred his horse toward town. Carlyle turned back to Gideon and Margaret. We'll escort you the rest of the way. Roads are still muddy from last night's storm, and I don't want you running into trouble this close to safety. The gesture surprised Gideon. In his experience, lawmen were usually obstacles at best and threats at worst, but Tom Carlyle seemed genuinely concerned, and when he smiled at Ruth sleeping in Gideon's arms, it was with the warmth of a grandfather. They traveled the last few miles together, the sheriff riding alongside the wagon and asking questions about the massacre site. Gideon gave him every detail he could remember, the location, the condition of the bodies, the 3 men who'd returned, even a description of their horses. If there was a chance these Red Canyon boys could be brought to justice, he wanted to help make it happen. You planning to stay in Sweetwater long? Carlyle asked after they'd exhausted the topic of the massacre. Don't know yet, Gideon admitted. Depends on what happens with the babies. Well, if you do decide to stay, come see me. Town's growing fast and we could use a man with your skills. My skills? You've got the look of someone who can handle himself. Ex-military, I'd wager. Maybe some time as a lawman or a scout. We need deputies, Mr. Hayes. Good men who know how to keep their heads in a crisis. Carlyle glanced meaningfully at the babies. And men who understand that sometimes the best use of a gun is not using it at all. Gideon didn't know how to respond to that, so he just nodded. The idea of being a lawman, of actually being part of a community instead of drifting through them, was so foreign it might as well have been spoken in another language. But it lodged in his mind anyway, a small seed of possibility. Sweetwater Creek appeared in the distance as the sun began its descent toward the western hills. It was larger than Gideon had expected, with a proper main street lined with wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon, a church with a white steeple, a bank, and several other establishments. Side streets branched off into residential areas where houses sat behind white picket fences, smoke rising from their chimneys in the cooling evening air. It looked permanent. It looked like home. People emerged from buildings as the wagon rolled down Main Street, word of their arrival having spread faster than their actual progress. Gideon felt dozens of eyes on them, heard the murmur of voices, and instinctively hunched his shoulders around the babies. He'd never been comfortable as the center of attention. Easy, Margaret murmured. They're just curious. Small towns are like that. Everyone knows everyone else's business before it happens. The deputy who'd ridden ahead was waiting outside a neat brick building with a sign reading, Dr. James Brennan, physician. A man in his 40s emerged as they pulled up, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows and a stethoscope around his neck. Margaret, Doc Brennan called out, his face breaking into a genuine smile. Heard you were coming in with some excitement. Let's see what you've brought me. Margaret climbed down and immediately began explaining the situation, the massacre, the fever, Ruth's current condition. Brennan listened intently, his eyes sharp and assessing as they moved between Gideon and the babies. When Margaret finished, he nodded once. "Bring them inside. I'll examine them both. Make sure there's no lasting damage from their ordeal." Gideon hesitated. Something about handing the babies over to a stranger, even a doctor, made his chest tight with anxiety. Ruth had been in his care for 4 days now. He knew her breathing patterns, her different cries, the exact way she liked to be held. What if the doctor didn't understand? What if he was too rough, or made her cry, or... "Mr. Hayes," Doc Brennan's voice was gentle but firm. "I've been delivering and caring for babies in this territory for 20 years. I promise you, I know what I'm doing." "I know, Gideon looked down at Ruth's sleeping face, then at Eli tucked against his other side. "I'll come in with you. I need to be there." If the doctor found this strange, he didn't show it. "Of course. This way." The interior of the doctor's office was clean and well organized, with medical techs lining shelves and the sharp smell of carbolic acid in the air. Brennan directed Gideon to lay the babies on an examination table, then lit several lamps to provide better light. For the next 30 minutes, Gideon stood tensely by while the doctor conducted a thorough examination of both infants. He checked their heartbeats, listened to their lungs, examined their skin and eyes and reflexes. Ruth woke halfway through and began to cry, and Gideon had to clench his fist to keep from snatching her up and comforting her. "She's scared," he said, unable to keep the edge from his voice. "She doesn't know you." "I understand. Almost done, little one." Brennan finished his examination and stepped back, nodding to Gideon. "You can pick her up now." Gideon gathered Ruth into his arms immediately, and her crying subsided as soon as she recognized his heartbeat, his smell, his voice murmuring reassurance. Eli, who'd tolerated the examination with his usual solemn silence, reached out a tiny hand toward his sister, and Gideon shifted so the twins could be close to each other. "Well?" Margaret asked from where she'd been hovering near the door. "What's the verdict?" "They're remarkably healthy, all things considered," Brennan said, washing his hands in a basin. "The girl, Ruth, you said? Her fever was from an ear infection that seems to be resolving. I'll give you some drops to help with that. The boy, Eli, is strong as an ox, no signs of malnutrition or serious distress in either of them." He turned to Gideon with an expression of respect. "Whatever you've been doing, Mr. Hayes, it's working. These babies should be dead after what they've been through. The fact that they're not is a testament to your care." Something loosened in Gideon's chest. He hadn't realized how terrified he'd been, that he'd done everything wrong, that his ignorance had somehow hurt them. "So they'll be okay?" "They'll be fine. Keep them warm, keep them fed, and bring them back in a week for a follow-up. Other than that, they just need what all babies need: love, attention, and patience." Brennan paused. "Speaking of which, have you thought about what happens next? Where they'll go?" "That's why we're here," Margaret interjected smoothly. "We're hoping Sweetwater might have families interested in adoption." "Might do. Let me think on it. In the meantime, you'll need a place to stay. Margaret, I assume you'll be at your house?" "Yes, and Gideon and the babies will be staying there as well, just until we sort things out." If Brennan found this arrangement unusual, he kept it to himself. "All right then, I'll put the word out that you're looking for potential families. In the meantime, if there's any change in the baby's condition, any fever, difficulty breathing, anything at all, you come straight back here." They thanked the doctor and emerged back onto Main Street to find a small crowd had gathered. Word had spread fast, as Margaret had predicted, and it seemed like half the town wanted a look at the orphaned babies and the drifter who'd saved them. An older woman pushed her way to the front, her flour-dusted apron and warm smile marking her as someone's beloved grandmother. "Margaret Wynne, you let me see those precious angels right this instant." "Mrs. Patterson." Margaret's voice held genuine affection. "I should have known you'd be first in line. This is Gideon Hayes, and these are Ruth and Eli." Mrs. Patterson's eyes went soft as she looked at the babies. "Oh, the poor darlings. Lost their mama, did they? Well, we'll just have to make sure they're looked after properly." She turned her formidable attention to Gideon. "And you, young man, Doc says you've been caring for them all by yourself? Yes, ma'am, with Miss Wynn's help these past few days. Mrs. Patterson studied him with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her because she nodded once, decisively. You come by my restaurant tomorrow morning, the Sweetwater Cafe right on Main Street. I'll have breakfast waiting and we can talk about what these babies need. It wasn't a request. Gideon found himself nodding agreement before he'd consciously decided to. Other townsfolk pressed forward with questions and offers of help. A woman named Sarah Miller offered baby clothes her children had outgrown. The general store owner, a man called Jacobson, insisted they take supplies on credit. The minister, Reverend Michaels, invited them to Sunday service and promised to include Ruth and Eli in the church's prayers. The attention was overwhelming. Gideon had spent so long being invisible, just another drifter passing through, that being seen, really seen, felt exposing and uncomfortable. But he also recognized genuine kindness when he saw it, and these people seemed honestly concerned about the baby's welfare. Sheriff Carlisle reappeared as the crowd began to disperse. Margaret, your house should be ready. I had my wife air it out when we got word you were coming. Wood stacked, pumps primed, and she left some provisions in the pantry. Thank you, Tom. That's very kind. Least we could do. Carlisle tipped his hat to Gideon. Mr. Hayes, my offer stands. If you need work, or if you just need someone to talk to about anything, my door's open. As they drove the last few blocks to Margaret's house, Gideon felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. It took him a moment to recognize it as hope. Fragile and tentative, but real nonetheless. Margaret's house was a small, neat cottage on the edge of town, with a covered porch and a well-tended garden that had gone a bit wild in her absence. She unlocked the door and led Gideon inside, lighting lamps to reveal a simple but comfortable interior. One main room served as kitchen and parlor, with a bedroom off to one side and a loft space above that could be reached by a ladder. It's not much, Margaret said, suddenly seeming uncertain, but it's warm and dry. You and the babies can have the bedroom. I'll take the loft. I can't take your bedroom, Gideon protested. You can and you will. The babies need to be on the ground floor in case Doc Brennan needs to come in the night. Besides, I've slept in worse places than a loft. Her tone left no room for argument. They spent the next hour settling in. Margaret showed Gideon where everything was: the pantry, the woodpile, the pump out back, the privy. He fed the babies while she started a fire in the stove and put coffee on to brew. By the time darkness had fully fallen, they'd created a makeshift nursery in one corner of the bedroom, with blankets and pillows arranged to make a safe sleeping space for the twins. Ruth and Eli, exhausted from the day's journey and the doctor's examination, fell asleep almost immediately. Gideon stood over them for a long moment, watching the rise and fall of their small chests, before finally allowing himself to step away. In the main room, Margaret had set out a simple dinner: bread, cheese, cold chicken, and coffee. They ate in comfortable silence, both too tired for much conversation. But as Gideon helped her clean up afterward, she touched his arm gently. You did good today, she said. I know it wasn't easy being stared at and questioned by half the town, but you handled it well. Felt like I was on display, Gideon admitted. All those eyes, all those questions. I wanted to grab the babies and run. But you didn't. You stayed, and you let people see that you care about Ruth and Eli. That matters, Gideon. When it comes time to decide what's best for them, people will remember that. What if what's best for them isn't me? The question had been gnawing at him all day. What if some nice family steps forward, people with a real home and money and stability? How can I compete with that? Margaret set down the dish she'd been drying and turned to face him fully. You're not competing with anyone. This isn't about being the richest or having the biggest house. It's about who loves them, who'll protect them, who'll be there when they wake up crying in the night. She paused. I saw at least a dozen couples in that crowd today who'd probably take the twins if asked. Good people, most of them, but not one of them looked at Ruth and Eli the way you do. How do I look at them? Like you'd fight God himself to keep them safe. Like they're not just babies you found, but babies you chose. That kind of love, it can't be manufactured or faked. Either you feel it or you don't. Her voice softened.
And you feel it, Gideon Hayes. Anyone with eyes can see that. He wanted to deny it, to maintain some emotional distance, but he couldn't. Not anymore. I didn't mean to, he said quietly. I was just trying to keep them alive until I could hand them off to someone more qualified. But somewhere along the way, you became their father, Margaret finished. It's all right. You're allowed to love them. The words hit him harder than any bullet ever had. You're allowed to love them. When had someone last given him permission to feel something other than grief and guilt? When had he last allowed himself to want something beyond the next meal, the next town, the next empty horizon? What about you? He asked, deflecting. I see how you are with them too. You light up when Ruth smiles. You've been teaching me how to care for them, but you could have just taken over yourself. Why bring me into it at all? Margaret looked away, color rising in her cheeks. Because they need a father figure, and because I've spent 5 years helping other women birth and raise children while telling myself I didn't want any of my own. That it was enough to be needed temporarily, to move on before I got too attached. She laughed softly, without much humor. Turns out, I was lying to myself. So what do? We do what we said we'd do. We stay here for the winter. We give Ruth and Eli the best care we can. We let the town see that they're loved and safe with us. And when spring comes, if someone else steps forward to adopt them, she trailed off, unable to finish. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, Gideon said, echoing her words from days earlier. A cry came from the bedroom, Ruth, waking from a bad dream. Gideon moved automatically, his exhaustion forgotten. He found her thrashing in her blankets, her face scrunched up and her mouth open in distress. Eli was stirring beside her, disturbed by his sister's cries. Gideon scooped Ruth up and began walking her around the small bedroom, rocking and humming. Shh, little bit, you're safe. I'm here. Nobody's going to hurt you. Margaret appeared in the doorway with Eli in her arms. Bad dream? Think so. She gets them sometimes, usually a few hours after falling asleep. They paced the bedroom together, each with a baby in their arms, moving in a slow dance that had become second nature over the past 4 days. Ruth's cries gradually subsided. Eli watched with those solemn eyes, his small hand reaching out to touch his sister's blanket, as if to reassure himself she was still there. They're lucky to have each other, Margaret murmured. Twins have a bond that's different from regular siblings. They'll always have someone who understands them completely. Like we had once, Gideon said without thinking. When Margaret looked at him questioningly, he explained, My sister, the one who died of cholera. We were close growing up, closer than most siblings. She was the only person who really understood me, who didn't judge me for being quiet or different. When she died, I lost not just a sister, but my best friend. I'm sorry, that must have been unbearable. It was. Still is sometimes. But standing here, watching Ruth and Eli together, I'm grateful they have each other. Whatever happens, wherever they end up, they'll have that bond. Nobody can take that away from them. Ruth had fallen back asleep, her head heavy on Gideon's shoulder. Margaret gently returned Eli to his nest of blankets, and Gideon did the same with Ruth, tucking her in carefully beside her brother. They stood together looking down at the sleeping twins, and Gideon felt Margaret's hand slip into his, a simple gesture of solidarity and something more. We'll protect them, she said softly. Whatever it takes, whatever we have to do, we'll make sure they're safe and loved. Yeah, Gideon agreed, his voice rough. We will. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the storm's passage leaving the air sharp and clean. Gideon woke to find Ruth staring at him from her blanket nest, wide awake but quiet, just watching him with those knowing eyes that reminded him so much of her brothers. Eli was still asleep, curled on his side with one tiny fist near his mouth. Morning, little bit, Gideon whispered, reaching down to pick Ruth up. She'd slept better after her nightmare, waking only twice for feeding and changing. Her fever was completely gone now, her cheeks pink with health instead of illness. Feeling better? Ruth grabbed his finger and held on tight, and Gideon felt that now familiar surge of fierce protectiveness. 4 days. It had only been 4 days since he'd found them, and already he couldn't imagine his life without them. Margaret was already up, making coffee and mixing batter for pancakes. She smiled when she saw him emerge with Ruth. Good morning. How'd she sleep? Better. Fever's gone.
She seems stronger. Good. We're supposed to meet Mrs. Patterson at the cafe in an hour. Think you can handle getting both babies ready while I finish breakfast? Gideon discovered he could. In fact, he could now dress, feed, and organize 2 infants in about half the time it had taken him initially. His hands had learned to be gentle, his movements confident. He still felt like he was making it up as he went along, but at least now he knew he wouldn't accidentally break them. They walked to the Sweetwater Cafe together, drawing curious but friendly looks from the townsfolk going about their morning business. The cafe was warm and bustling, filled with the smells of bacon and coffee and fresh bread. Mrs. Patterson spotted them immediately and waved them to a corner booth, already set with plates and cups. There you are. Sit, sit. I've got pancakes coming, and eggs and bacon. You both look like you haven't had a proper meal in days. She peered at the babies with grandmotherly concern. And how are these little angels this morning? Much better, thank you, ma'am, Gideon said, settling into the booth with Ruth in his arms while Margaret managed Eli and the various bags they'd brought. Mrs. Patterson didn't waste time on small talk. As soon as she'd delivered their food and poured coffee, she got down to business. So, Margaret tells me you're looking for families who might want to adopt these 2. That right? That's the idea, Margaret confirmed, though nothing's decided yet. We want to make sure they go somewhere safe, somewhere they'll be loved. Mrs. Patterson's sharp eyes moved between Gideon, Margaret, and the babies. And you 2? What's your plan? We're staying for the winter, Gideon said. Figured we'd care for them until we find the right situation. Together? Under one roof? Mrs. Patterson's tone wasn't judgmental, just clarifying. Yes, ma'am. Margaret's been kind enough to let us stay at her place. Separate sleeping arrangements, Gideon added, feeling his face heat. All proper. I wasn't suggesting otherwise, young man. Though people will talk, you know how small towns are. A man and woman living together, even with babies as chaperones, it'll cause gossip. She took a sip of her coffee. Of course, there's a simple way to silence that gossip, if you were inclined. Margaret choked on her pancake. Mrs. Patterson, I'm just saying, you 2 clearly care about those babies. You work well together. And neither of you is getting any younger. She held up a hand to forestall protest. I'm not pushing, just observing. Now about families. There are 3 couples in town who've been looking to adopt. The Millers, you met Sarah yesterday, lost a baby last year and haven't been able to conceive again. Good people, stable. Then there's the Hendersons, who run the dry goods store. No children of their own, been married 10 years. And the Carters, ranchers about 5 miles out. They've got 2 older boys and always wanted a daughter. Gideon felt his stomach tighten. These were real possibilities, real families who could give Ruth and Eli the kind of life he couldn't. Stable homes, 2 parents, financial security. Everything he didn't have to offer. Would any of them take both babies? Margaret asked. Ruth and Eli shouldn't be separated. Mrs. Patterson's expression turned somber. That's where it gets tricky. The Millers and Hendersons, they're townfolk with modest means. 2 babies at once would be a strain. The Carters have more resources, but... She hesitated. I'll be honest with you. Most folks looking to adopt want to pick 1 child. Twins are seen as twice the work, twice the expense. Finding someone willing to take both won't be easy. Gideon felt Margaret stiffen beside him. They can't be separated, she said firmly. They're all each other has left of their family. Splitting them up would be cruel. I agree, dear. I'm just telling you how it is. Mrs. Patterson reached across the table and patted Margaret's hand. But don't give up hope yet. Let me talk to these families, feel them out about taking both children. And in the meantime, you 2 just keep doing what you're doing. Those babies are thriving with you. After breakfast, they walked back through town, both quiet and thoughtful. The morning sun was warm on their faces, and Main Street was busy with activity. Gideon noticed people nodding to them, tipping hats, smiling at the babies. It was strange and uncomfortable and oddly pleasant all at once. They were passing the general store when a woman emerged, her arms full of packages. She was young, maybe 25, with blonde hair and a dress that marked her as someone with money. When she saw them, her face lit up. Oh my goodness, are these the babies everyone's talking about? She set down her packages and approached without waiting for permission. They're absolutely precious. May I? Before Gideon could respond, she'd reached out and touched Ruth's cheek. Ruth, startled by the unfamiliar contact, began to cry. The woman pulled back, startled. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to frighten her." "It's all right, Mrs. Henderson," Margaret said smoothly, though Gideon could hear the tension in her voice. "She's just not used to strangers yet. This is Gideon Hayes, and these are Ruth and Eli." Mrs. Henderson, one of the couple's Mrs. Patterson had mentioned. Gideon studied her with new attention. She seemed nice enough, genuinely distressed at having upset Ruth. Her husband emerged from the store behind her, a tall man with thinning hair and kind eyes. "Everything all right, Caroline?" he asked. "Yes, dear. I was just admiring the orphaned babies. They're so beautiful." She turned to her husband. "Harold, don't you think they're beautiful?" Harold Henderson looked at the twins with an expression that was hard to read. Interest, certainly, but something else, too. Calculation, maybe? "Very nice," he said diplomatically. "You're the ones caring for them?" "For now," Gideon said, his arms tightening protectively around Ruth. Something about this man made him uneasy, though he couldn't have said why. "Until we find them a proper home." "I see. Well, if you need any supplies, come by the store. We'll give you a good price, what with you doing such charitable work." Harold took his wife's arm. "Come along, Caroline. We have calls to make." As they walked away, Gideon heard Mrs. Henderson whisper something to her husband, and his response, "We'll discuss it later, dear." "Well," Margaret said quietly, "that was interesting." "She seemed genuinely interested in the babies," Gideon observed. "He seemed interested in something else entirely. Couldn't tell what." "The Hendersons are prosperous, respected. If they wanted to adopt—" She trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. The rest of the day passed in a blur of settling into their new temporary life. Gideon chopped wood for Margaret's stove while she did laundry. They took turns with the babies, learning each other's rhythms and routines. By evening, they'd fallen into a comfortable domesticity that felt both foreign and natural to Gideon. That night, after the babies were asleep, they sat together on Margaret's small porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. The town was quiet around them, just the occasional sound of a dog barking or a door closing. "You thinking about the Hendersons?" Margaret asked. "Yeah. And the others Mrs. Patterson mentioned. What if one of them wants the babies? What if they can offer a better life than we can?" "Is that what you think? That we're not good enough?" Gideon was quiet for a long moment. "I think I'm terrified of losing them, and I think I'm even more terrified that I have no right to feel that way." He turned to look at Margaret in the dim light. 4 days ago, I didn't even know they existed. Now I can't imagine. I don't want to imagine. Life without them," Margaret finished. "I know, I feel the same way." She reached over and took his hand, and Gideon didn't pull away. "But we have to remember that this isn't about what we want. It's about what's best for Ruth and Eli." "And what if what's best for them is staying with us?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to address fully. But it was out there now, spoken aloud, and there was no taking it back. "Then we'll figure it out," Margaret said finally. "Together. Whatever happens, whatever we have to do, we'll make sure those babies have the best life possible, even if that means letting them go." But as they sat there in the darkness, hands intertwined, both listening to the soft sounds of Ruth and Eli breathing in sleep through the open window, Gideon knew that letting go would be the hardest thing he'd ever done. Harder than war, harder than grief, harder than 15 years of lonely drifting. Because somewhere in a desert canyon, carrying 2 dying babies through a storm, Gideon Hayes had stopped being a drifter and started being something else entirely. He just didn't know yet if the world would let him keep the life he'd accidentally found, or if fate had one more loss waiting for him around the corner. The question lingered between them long after they'd said goodnight and retreated to their separate sleeping spaces. Gideon lay awake in Margaret's bedroom, with the babies breathing softly beside him, staring at the ceiling and wondering when exactly his life had veered so far off the solitary path he'd walked for 15 years. Above him, he could hear Margaret shifting restlessly in the loft, and he knew she was wrestling with the same thoughts that kept him from sleep. The next few days settled into a rhythm that felt dangerously close to permanence. Gideon woke early each morning to feed and change the babies while Margaret prepared breakfast. They'd eat together, talking quietly about small things, The weather, the town gossip Margaret had heard at the general store, Ruth's improving health, Eli's first real smile. After breakfast, Gideon would walk to the lumberyard where Sheriff Carlisle had arranged temporary work for him, carrying boards and hammering frames alongside men who asked few questions but watched him with cautious respect. The pay wasn't much, but it was honest work, and it felt good to have money in his pocket that he'd earned with his hands instead of his gun. Margaret spent her days tending to the babies and seeing patients who came to her for medical advice. Word had spread quickly that she was back in town, and women began appearing at her door with various ailments and concerns. Gideon would return each afternoon to find her in consultation with someone, or mixing herbs, or writing instructions for tonics and treatments. She moved through this work with confident grace, her hands sure, and her voice calm, and Gideon found himself watching her sometimes with something that felt uncomfortably close to admiration. On the fourth day after their arrival in Sweetwater, Mrs. Patterson appeared at their door just as they were finishing dinner. She had the look of someone bearing news she wasn't entirely happy about. "May I come in?" she asked, though she was already stepping through the doorway. "I've been talking to those families I mentioned, and I have some information you'll want to hear." They settled around Margaret's small table, the babies playing on a blanket nearby. Ruth had begun trying to grab at things, her small hands opening and closing with determined focus. Eli watched his sister with those solemn eyes, occasionally reaching out to pat her arm as if to encourage her efforts. "I'll start with the good news," Mrs. Patterson said, accepting the coffee Margaret offered. "The Millers and the Carters are both interested in the babies. The Millers especially. Sarah came by the cafe this morning and talked for an hour about how much they'd love to give a child a home." "That's wonderful," Margaret said, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "And the bad news?" "Neither family wants to take both babies. The Millers can only manage one, financially speaking. They'd prefer Ruth, if it came to that. They lost a daughter, you see, and Sarah's heart is set on having another little girl. The Carters would take either twin, but they're firm about only wanting one. They've already got 2 boys to feed and educate, and they don't feel they could handle 2 infants on top of that." Gideon felt his jaw tighten. "And the Hendersons?" Mrs. Patterson's expression grew even more troubled. "That's where things get complicated. Harold Henderson came to see me yesterday, made a very generous offer. They'd take both babies, provide for them handsomely, give them every advantage." She paused. "But there are conditions." "What kind of conditions?" Margaret asked, her voice sharp. "They'd want to move away from Sweetwater. Henderson's been wanting to expand his business, and he's got opportunities in Denver. He'd take the babies with them, raise them there. New start, new life. No connection to their past." Mrs. Patterson looked at Gideon meaningfully. "No connection to you either. He was very clear about that. If they adopt the twins, you'd have no further contact. Clean break, he called it." The words hit Gideon like a physical blow. He'd known, intellectually, that adoption might mean losing touch with Ruth and Eli, but hearing it stated so baldly, so clinically, made it real in a way that terrified him. "Why?" he managed. "Why would he insist on that?" "I can only speculate," Mrs. Patterson said carefully. "But Harold Henderson is a proud man, used to being in control. I think he wants these babies, but he wants them to be his completely. No complications, no former guardian hovering around with conflicting ideas about how they should be raised." "That's not right," Margaret said firmly. "These children have already lost their parents. Now Henderson wants to erase even the memory of the man who saved their lives?" "I'm just telling you what he said. Whether it's right or wrong isn't for me to judge." Mrs. Patterson turned to Gideon. "But I will tell you this. You have options here. The Millers and Carters are good people. If you were willing to separate the twins, either family would provide a loving home." "No." The word came out harder than Gideon intended. "Ruth and Eli stay together. That's not negotiable." "Then your only option is the Hendersons and their conditions." Mrs. Patterson's voice gentled. "Unless you were thinking about keeping them yourselves." The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and Ruth's happy gurgling as she finally managed to grab the wooden rattle Gideon had carved for her. "We have no legal claim to them, and people are already talking about our living arrangement." "Well," Mrs. Patterson said with studied casualness, "those first 2 problems have a fairly obvious solution. As for the talking,
people will always talk. The question is whether you care more about gossip or about those babies. Gideon's heart was hammering so hard he was sure the women could hear it. You're suggesting we get married? Just like that? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm simply pointing out facts. Mrs. Patterson stood, smoothing her apron. The Hendersons want an answer by the end of the week. That gives you 4 days to decide what you want to do. In the meantime, I'd recommend you both do some serious thinking about what matters most. After she left, Gideon and Margaret sat in stunned silence.
Ruth had tired of her rattle and was making cranky sounds. But for once, Gideon didn't immediately move to comfort her. He was too busy trying to process the impossible situation they'd found themselves in. "Marriage," Margaret finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's talking about a marriage of convenience, a practical arrangement." "Is that what it would be?" Gideon asked, looking at her directly. "Convenient and practical?" Margaret met his eyes, and the air between them suddenly felt charged with something they'd both been carefully avoiding. "I don't know. What do you think it would be?" Before Gideon could answer, Ruth's cranky sounds escalated to full crying. He rose automatically and scooped her up, grateful for the interruption. His mind was spinning too fast, his emotions too tangled to put into words. Marriage. To Margaret. To keep the babies. It was everything he wanted and everything he'd spent 15 years running from, all wrapped up in one terrifying package. "She needs to sleep," he said, falling back on the practical. "It's past her bedtime. I'll put them down." "Gideon, we'll talk about this tomorrow, when we've both had time to think." He carried Ruth toward the bedroom, Eli cradled in his other arm and tried not to notice the hurt that flashed across Margaret's face. But that night, lying in the darkness with the babies sleeping beside him, Gideon couldn't stop thinking about her question. What would a marriage between them be? They'd known each other for barely a week, though it felt like longer. They worked well together, understood each other's silences, had built something that resembled a family out of necessity and shared purpose. But was that enough foundation for a marriage? And what about Sarah? His first wife, dead these 15 years, but still occupying a space in his heart that felt wrong to offer to someone else. Would Margaret understand that part of him would always belong to a ghost? Could he ask her to accept that? Sleep came slowly and brought dreams of the war, of Sarah's grave, of holding Ruth and Eli while they dissolved into smoke in his arms. He woke gasping just before dawn, his shirt damp with sweat, to find Ruth awake and watching him with those knowing eyes that seemed too old for her infant face. "Morning, little bit," he whispered, gathering her up. "You have bad dreams too?" She made a small sound and patted his chest with her tiny hand, and something in Gideon's heart cracked a little wider. This baby, this tiny stranger, trusted him completely, needed him, loved him perhaps in the uncomplicated way infants loved anyone who cared for them. And he loved her back, loved both of them with a fierceness that terrified him. But was love enough? Was it fair to Margaret to marry her just to keep the babies? And what about Ruth and Eli? Would they be better off with the Hendersons' money and stability, even if it meant losing the man who'd carried them through the desert? He didn't have answers. He just had questions and fear, and 2 babies who needed him to figure it out. Margaret was already up when he emerged from the bedroom, moving quietly around the kitchen in the pre-dawn dimness. She'd made coffee and was mixing batter for biscuits, her movements mechanical, her face drawn with exhaustion. She hadn't slept either, Gideon realized. "Morning," he said softly. She jumped, startled, then offered a tired smile. "Morning, coffee's ready." They worked together in silence, preparing breakfast and tending to the babies. Eli woke cheerful and hungry, making small cooing sounds that seemed designed to lighten the heavy mood. Ruth was more subdued, seeming to pick up on the tension between the adults, her eyes moving from Gideon to Margaret and back with unusual solemnity. It was only after both babies had been fed and changed that Margaret finally spoke about the elephant in the room. "We should talk about what Mrs. Patterson said." "Yeah." Gideon set down his coffee cup. "We should." "I've been thinking about it all night," Margaret admitted, "about what it would mean. Marriage, keeping the babies, staying here permanently." She twisted her hands together nervously. "It's not what either of us planned. A week ago, we were strangers. Now we're talking about building a life together." A life based on practical necessity, Gideon said. Not exactly the foundation most marriages are built on. No, but not the worst foundation either. Margaret looked at him directly. I've seen marriages built on love fall apart when times got hard. And I've seen marriages built on mutual respect and shared purpose last a lifetime. We have respect. We have purpose. Maybe that's enough. And if it's not, if we end up miserable, trapped in something neither of us really wanted, then at least Ruth and Eli will have a home, parents who love them, even if those parents don't love each other. Margaret's voice was steady, but Gideon could hear the hurt underneath. That's what this comes down to, isn't it? What's best for them, not what's easiest or most comfortable for us. Gideon stood and walked to the window, looking out at Sweetwater's main street beginning to wake with the day. Smoke rose from chimneys. A dog barked. A man drove a wagon toward the general store, his breath misting in the cold morning air. It was such an ordinary scene, the kind of peaceful morning he'd ridden past 1,000 times without a second thought. But now it looked different. It looked like home. Or it could, if he was brave enough to claim it. I was married once, he said without turning around. Sarah. She was everything, kind, patient, stronger than me in all the ways that mattered. When she died, I thought I'd die too. Wanted to, some days. I told myself I'd never love anyone like that again because I couldn't survive that kind of loss twice. And now? Margaret asked quietly. Now I realize I was wrong. I can't control who I love or who I lose. All I can control is what I do with the time I have. He turned to face her. The truth is, Margaret, I think I could love you. Maybe I already do, a little. But I'm terrified of what that means, terrified of failing you the way I failed Sarah. Margaret stood and crossed to him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. You didn't fail Sarah. You were at war. That wasn't your fault. Tell that to the part of me that's been carrying the guilt for 15 years. Then let me help you carry it, she said simply. That's what partners do. They share the weight, so neither has to bear it alone. She reached up and touched his face gently. I could love you too, Gideon Hayes. In fact, I think I'm already halfway there. But I'm not asking for a great romance or undying passion. I'm just asking for honesty and effort and willingness to try. Can you give me that? He looked down at her, this strong, capable woman who'd appeared out of nowhere and changed everything, and felt the last of his resistance crumble. Yes, he said. Yes, I can give you that. Then we have our answer. We'll marry, we'll keep the babies, and we'll build something real, something that matters. She smiled, tentative but genuine. Besides, we've already survived a massacre site, a storm, and Mrs. Patterson's interrogation. Compared to that, marriage should be easy. Gideon laughed, the sound startling him with its naturalness. When you put it that way, they sealed the decision with a kiss that was gentle and uncertain and full of promise. It wasn't the passionate embrace of young lovers, but it was real and honest, and that felt more valuable somehow. When they pulled apart, Ruth was watching them with what looked suspiciously like approval, and Eli had grabbed his own foot and was trying to eat it with single-minded determination. Well, Margaret said, her cheeks flushed, I suppose we should tell Mrs. Patterson and find Reverend Michaels and figure out how to actually do this. One step at a time, Gideon said. First step, coffee. Lots of coffee. Word of their engagement spread through Sweetwater faster than a prairie fire. By noon, it seemed like half the town had found excuses to walk past Margaret's house or stop by the cafe where they'd gone to tell Mrs. Patterson the news. The reaction was mixed, some genuinely happy, others clearly skeptical, a few openly disapproving of the hasty courtship and even hastier marriage plans. Harold Henderson was one of the disapproving ones. He appeared at Margaret's door that evening, his wife Caroline notably absent, his face set in stern lines. Miss Wynne, Mr. Hayes, I'd like a word. They invited him in reluctantly. Gideon positioned himself between Henderson and the babies, who were playing on their blanket, an instinctive protective gesture that didn't escape the merchant's notice. I understand congratulations are in order, Henderson said, though his tone suggested he felt anything but congratulatory. A sudden engagement. Very sudden. We know our own minds, Margaret said coolly. Is there something we can help you with, Mr. Henderson? Actually, yes. I came to make one final offer regarding the children. He looked at Ruth and Eli with an expression that was hard to read. My wife has her heart set on having a family. We're prepared to offer a very generous arrangement, $2,000 paid to you both, in exchange for legal guardianship of both twins. They'd want for nothing. The best schools, the best opportunities, a real future. The sum was staggering. $2,000 was more money than Gideon had seen in his entire life. It could buy a house, land, security for years to come. And Henderson was offering it freely, no strings attached except giving up Ruth and Eli. No, Gideon said before Margaret could speak. They're not for sale. I'm not trying to buy them, Henderson said, his voice sharp. I'm trying to give them a better life than a drifter and an itinerant midwife can provide. No offense intended, but what can you offer them? Margaret's house is barely big enough for one person, much less a family of 4. Hayes, you're working day labor at the lumber yard. That's no way to raise children.
Maybe not, Margaret said, her voice level, but her eyes flashing with anger. But we love them. Can you say the same, Mr. Henderson? Or do you just want them as what? A project? A way to satisfy your wife's desire for motherhood? Henderson's face flushed. How dare you suggest? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm asking a direct question. Do you love Ruth and Eli? Do you know that Ruth gets fussy around sunset and needs to be rocked in a specific way? That Eli watches faces like he's memorizing them? That they comfort each other when they're scared? Margaret stepped forward. Those babies aren't blank slates for you to mold into whatever you want them to be. They're people with histories and needs and hearts that have already been broken once. They need parents who see them, truly see them, not benefactors looking for a good deed. Henderson stood abruptly, his jaw tight. I see I'm wasting my time here. When reality sets in and you realize you've bitten off more than you can chew, don't come crying to me for help. We won't, Gideon said firmly. After Henderson left, Margaret collapsed into a chair, shaking. That was terrifying. What if he was right? What if we can't provide for them properly? Then we'll figure it out, Gideon said, kneeling beside her chair. Together. Like you said, we share the weight. Besides, Henderson was wrong about one thing. What's that? I'm not just a drifter doing day labor anymore. Sheriff Carlisle offered me a deputy position this morning. Steady pay, a badge, a place in the community. He'd been planning to discuss it with Margaret before deciding, but Henderson's visit had crystallized his thinking. I was going to wait to tell you, but I want to take it. I want to build something here, for us, for them. Margaret's eyes widened. Gideon, that's wonderful. Why didn't you say something earlier? Because I wasn't sure I deserved it. Wasn't sure I could be that man, the kind who wears a badge and enforces law instead of running from it. He looked at Ruth and Eli, who'd abandoned their playing to watch the adults with those 2 knowing eyes. But for them, I can try. You'll be more than that. You'll be exactly what this town needs. Someone who understands that law isn't just about rules and punishment, but about protecting people who can't protect themselves. She leaned forward and kissed him softly. I'm proud of you. The words hit him harder than he'd expected. When was the last time someone had said they were proud of him? Not since before the war, certainly. Maybe never. 3 days later, they stood before Reverend Michael's in the small white church at the edge of town. Margaret wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Patterson had insisted on lending her, with wildflowers in her hair that Sarah Miller had brought that morning. Gideon had scrubbed up as best he could, wearing clean clothes and a nervous expression that made several of the assembled townspeople smile. Ruth and Eli were there too, held by Mrs. Patterson during the ceremony, both babies dressed in small white gowns that seemed to glow in the afternoon light filtering through the church windows. The congregation was small. Sheriff Carlisle and his wife, the Millers, a few other friendly faces, but their presence felt significant, witnesses to this unlikely family being forged. Dearly beloved, Reverend Michaels began, and Gideon tried to focus on the words, but his mind kept drifting to all the ways this could go wrong. What if he failed Margaret the way he'd failed Sarah? What if he couldn't be the father Ruth and Eli needed? What if... Margaret squeezed his hand and he looked down at her.
She was smiling, and in her eyes he saw not blind optimism, but clear-eyed understanding. She knew the risks. She knew his ghosts. And she was choosing this anyway. Choosing him, choosing them. Do you, Gideon Hayes, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? Gideon thought of Sarah, buried under a willow tree back in Missouri. Thought of his baby daughter who'd never drawn a full breath. Thought of his sister, dead of cholera, and all the years he'd spent running from the pain of loving and losing. Then he looked at Margaret and at Ruth and Eli watching him with those solemn eyes, and he realized something fundamental. He was done running. I do, he said clearly. And do you, Margaret Wynne, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? I do, Margaret said without hesitation. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of New Mexico and Almighty God, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. The kiss was brief and sweet, and when they turned to face the small congregation, Gideon felt a surge of something he barely recognized as happiness. Mrs. Patterson came forward with the babies, and suddenly Gideon and Margaret were standing there as a family. Husband, wife, son, daughter, and it felt right in a way nothing had felt right in 15 years. The wedding celebration was held at Mrs. Patterson's cafe, with food and music and more goodwill than Gideon knew what to do with. People he barely knew came up to shake his hand and wish them well. Sarah Miller hugged Margaret and cried happy tears. Sheriff Carlisle pulled Gideon aside and officially offered him the deputy position, complete with a badge that felt heavy with responsibility and promise. You did good, Hayes, Carlisle said, watching Margaret laugh at something Mrs. Patterson had said while bouncing Ruth on her hip. Not many men would have done what you did, saving those babies, caring for them, building a life around them. That takes character. I just did what needed doing. That's exactly what I mean. You saw a need and you met it. No glory-seeking, no expectation of reward. That's the kind of man I want wearing a badge in my town. Carlisle clapped him on the shoulder. Welcome to the Sweetwater Sheriff's Department, Deputy Hayes. As the celebration wound down and the sun began to set, Gideon found himself standing outside the cafe with Eli in his arms, watching the sky turn gold and pink and orange. The baby was drowsy, his small head heavy on Gideon's shoulder, one tiny fist clutching Gideon's shirt with sleepy determination. Margaret emerged with Ruth, wrapping a shawl around both herself and the baby against the evening chill. She came to stand beside Gideon, and for a moment they just stood there together, watching the sunset and feeling the weight of what they'd done settle over them. Scared? She asked softly. Terrified, Gideon admitted. You? Same, but also... She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the sunset colors. Also hopeful. Is that crazy? If it is, we're both crazy. He shifted Eli to one arm and put the other around Margaret, pulling her close. But I'll take crazy and hopeful over sane and alone any day. They walked home through the quiet streets as night fell, Sweetwater settling into evening routines around them. Lamplight glowed in windows. Somewhere a dog barked. A horse whinnied in a distant corral. Ordinary sounds of ordinary life, and they were part of it now instead of observers passing through. Back at the house, their house now, legally and officially, they put the babies to bed together, moving through the routine they'd established over the past week. Ruth was getting stronger every day, her fever completely gone, her appetite robust. Eli remained the quieter twin, but he'd begun making more sounds, small coos and gurgles that seemed designed to get attention. They're happy, Margaret observed as they tucked the babies in. You can see it in their faces. They feel safe. Because of you, Gideon said. You taught me how to care for them. No, I taught you the mechanics. You supplied the love all on your own. She straightened and looked around the small bedroom that would now be shared by all four of them until they could afford something bigger. We're going to need more space eventually. This house is too small for a growing family. One problem at a time, Gideon said. Tonight, let's just be grateful we have a roof and each other and two healthy babies. They made tea and sat together in the front room,
not talking much, just being together. The fire crackled in the stove. Outside, wind rustled through the cottonwoods.
And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tension that had been coiling in Gideon's shoulders for days began to ease. "Thank you," he said suddenly. Margaret looked at him questioningly. "For what?" "For stopping that day in the canyon, for helping, for teaching me that I could be more than just a man running from his past." He set down his tea and took her hand. "For giving me a reason to stay in one place long enough to build something real." "You gave me the same thing," Margaret said. "I've spent 5 years telling myself I was content with my nomadic life, helping people and moving on before I got too attached. But I wasn't content. I was lonely. I was hiding from my grief just like you were hiding from yours." She squeezed his hand. "You and Ruth and Eli, you gave me permission to want more, to build a home instead of just visiting other people's homes." They sat in comfortable silence until exhaustion drove them to their sleeping spaces. At the bedroom door, Margaret paused and looked back at Gideon, who'd taken his usual spot on the floor by the fire. "You know," she said carefully, "we're married now. You don't have to sleep out here." Gideon's heart kicked against his ribs. We said this was practical, not—" "It is practical, but it's also real, Gideon. We're husband and wife. We're partners. And I'd like my partner closer than the front room floor." She blushed, but didn't look away. I'm just saying you don't have to be alone anymore. In any sense." He stood slowly, hardly daring to believe what she was offering. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure that I trust you. I'm sure that I care about you. I'm sure that we've already built something worth protecting." She smiled. "The rest? We'll figure it out as we go. Together." So Gideon followed her into the bedroom, and they lay down together on opposite sides of the bed, with the babies sleeping in their nest on the floor nearby. It was chaste and careful and nothing like his first wedding night with Sarah, but it felt right. Margaret's breathing eventually evened out into sleep, and Gideon lay there in the darkness, feeling the warmth of her presence beside him and listening to Ruth and Eli's soft snores. This was his family now. This was his home. And tomorrow he'd wake up and put on a badge and try to be worthy of both. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, for the first time in 15 years, Gideon Hayes fell asleep feeling something dangerously close to peace. But peace, he had learned soon enough, was always temporary in a frontier town. 3 days after the wedding, Trouble rode into Sweetwater on swift horses, wearing dust and carrying guns, and everything Gideon and Margaret had built was put to the test. It started with a rider galloping into town at full speed, his horse lathered and heaving. Gideon was at the sheriff's office when the man pulled up, and he recognized the look of someone running from death. "Raiders," the man gasped, sliding from his horse. "The Red Canyon boys. They hit the Bar T Ranch at dawn, killed 2 men, burned the barn, took everything that wasn't nailed down. They're heading this way, maybe 2 hours behind me." Sheriff Carlisle's face went grim. "How many?" "I counted 20, maybe more. They're armed to the teeth and mean as snakes." The rider looked around desperately. "You got to evacuate. Get the women and children to safety. These men don't leave survivors." Gideon's blood went cold. Margaret, Ruth, Eli. They were at home, undefended, with a gang of murderers riding toward town. "Go," Carlisle said, seeing Gideon's face. "Get your family somewhere safe, then get back here. We'll need every gun we can get." Gideon ran. He'd never moved faster in his life, his boots pounding the dirt street, his heart hammering with fear. He burst through the door of his house to find Margaret calmly folding laundry while the babies napped. "Gideon, what's wrong?" "Raiders coming, the Red Canyon boys. We have maybe 2 hours." He was already moving, gathering supplies with hands that wanted to shake but couldn't afford to. "We need to get you and the babies somewhere safe." To her credit, Margaret didn't waste time with questions or panic. She immediately began packing essentials, clothes, food, the baby's bottles, and medicine. Gideon woke Ruth and Eli as gently as he could, but they still fussed, confused and cranky at being disturbed. "Where are we going?" Margaret asked as she strapped Eli to her chest. "Church has a cellar, stone walls, only one entrance. Half the town will be there." Gideon secured Ruth in his arms and grabbed their packed bags. Carlisle's organizing a defense. The men will hold Main Street while the women and children hide. They joined a stream of townspeople, all heading for the church, faces tight with fear. Mrs. Patterson was there, organizing people with her usual efficiency, directing families to the cellar and making sure everyone had water and supplies. When she saw Margaret and Gideon, relief flooded her face. "Thank God. I was about to send someone for you." She looked at Gideon's deputy badge. "You're going back, aren't you?" "Have to. Can't let good men fight alone." "Then God go with you." Mrs. Patterson took Ruth from his arms, her face softening as she looked at the baby. "We'll keep them safe. You have my word." Gideon turned to Margaret, and the fear in her eyes nearly broke him. She grabbed his hand, holding tight. "Come back," she said simply. "Promise me you'll come back." "I promise." He kissed her hard, pouring everything he couldn't say into that one desperate moment. Then he kissed Ruth's forehead and Eli's, memorizing their faces in case it was the last time. "I love you," he told Margaret, the words tumbling out unplanned. "All of you. I love you." "I love you too," Margaret whispered. "Now go. And don't you dare die on me, Gideon Hayes. We've got too much life left to live." He forced himself to walk away, to leave his entire world in that cellar while he went to face men who killed for sport. But as he jogged back toward Main Street, he felt a clarity of purpose he'd never experienced, not even in the war. Then he'd fought for abstract concepts, the Union, freedom, duty. Now he was fighting for something concrete and precious, a wife who trusted him, 2 babies who needed him, and a town that had given him a second chance at life. Sheriff Carlisle had gathered about 15 men, ranging from experienced fighters like himself to shopkeepers and ranchers who'd probably never fired a gun in anger. They were setting up barricades across Main Street, using wagons and barrels and anything else they could find for cover. "Glad you're back," Carlisle said, handing Gideon a rifle. "You ever been in a gunfight?" "More than I'd like to remember." "Good. Because those boys coming at us, they're professionals. We're outgunned and outnumbered. Our only advantage is that we're defending home, and they're just raiders looking for easy pickings. We make it hard enough, they might decide to find easier prey." Gideon checked his weapons, his Colt .45, the rifle Carlisle had given him, and the knife in his boot. Everything in working order, everything ready. He took up a position behind an overturned wagon and settled in to wait, his eyes fixed on the eastern road where the raiders would appear. The next hour was the longest of his life. Every minute felt like an hour. Every sound made him flinch. He kept thinking of Margaret's face, of Ruth's tiny hand wrapped around his finger, of Eli's solemn eyes. He'd promised to come back. He had to keep that promise. Finally, just as the sun reached its apex, a rider appeared on the eastern road. Then another. Then a whole line of them, maybe 25 strong, riding slowly and deliberately toward town. They stopped just outside rifle range, and a man rode forward alone, presumably their leader. "Town of Sweetwater," he called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "We don't want trouble. Just hand over your valuables, and we'll be on our way. Nobody needs to die today." "Go to hell," someone shouted from the barricades. The raider leader shrugged. "Suit yourselves, boys. Burn it down." What followed was chaos. The raiders charged, firing as they came. Bullets slammed into the barricades, splintering wood and ricocheting off metal. Gideon fired back mechanically, his war training taking over, picking targets and squeezing the trigger with cold precision. Men fell on both sides, the air filled with smoke and the screams of wounded horses and the sharp crack of gunfire. A raider made it past the barricades, his gun swinging toward Sheriff Carlisle's exposed back. Gideon fired without thinking, and the man went down hard. Carlisle shot him a grateful look and kept fighting. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The raiders were brutal, but not organized, each man fighting for himself rather than working as a unit. The defenders, despite being outnumbered, held their positions through sheer desperation and determination. Then Gideon saw him. One of the raiders had broken through and was riding toward the church, toward the cellar where Margaret and the babies and half the town were hiding. The man had a torch in one hand and murder in his eyes. Gideon didn't hesitate. He vaulted the barricade and ran, chasing the rider on foot. He fired his rifle, missed. Fired his pistol, missed again. The raider was almost to the church when Gideon threw his knife. It was a desperate, impossible throw, the kind you saw in dime novels but never in real life. The knife caught the raider in the shoulder. He screamed and dropped the torch, wheeling his horse around. Gideon tackled him out of the saddle, and they went down in a tangle of limbs. The raider was bigger, meaner, and fought dirty. He got his hands around Gideon's throat and squeezed. Gideon's vision started to gray. He could hear the battle still raging, could hear someone shouting his name, but it seemed very far away. His hands scrabbled in the dirt, searching for something, anything. His fingers closed on the torch, still burning. He swung it blindly and connected with the raider's face. The man screamed and released him, clutching his burned cheek. Gideon sucked in air and grabbed his fallen pistol, pressing it to the raider's chest. "Stay down," he rasped. "Stay down or I end it." The raider, face twisted with pain and fury, stayed down. When Gideon looked up, the battle was over. The raiders, or what was left of them, were retreating, leaving their dead and wounded behind. The defenders stood at their barricades, bloodied and exhausted but alive. They'd won. Gideon secured his prisoner and stumbled back toward Main Street on shaking legs. Carlyle met him halfway, supporting him as his adrenaline crashed and his injuries made themselves known. He had a gash on his forehead he didn't remember getting, bruises forming on his throat from where the raider had tried to strangle him, and about a dozen other aches and pains. "You stupid, brave son of a gun," Carlyle said, but he was grinning. "You saved the church. Probably saved half the people in that cellar." "Just doing my job, Sheriff." "That's more than the job. That's heroism." Carlyle clapped his shoulder. "Now go see your family before your wife kills me for keeping you." Gideon limped to the church where people were already emerging from the cellar, checking the damage and looking for loved ones. Margaret appeared in the doorway with both babies, her eyes frantically scanning the crowd. When she saw him, her face crumpled with relief. She ran to him, still carrying Eli, and Gideon caught her in his arms, holding her and their son while Ruth reached for him from Mrs. Patterson's arms. They stood there in the afternoon sun, a family reunited, while around them Sweetwater began picking up the pieces. "You came back," Margaret sobbed against his chest. "You promised, and you came back." "Always," Gideon said, his voice rough from the raider's grip. "I'll always come back to you." And standing there, holding his entire world in his arms while the town he'd helped save celebrated survival around them, Gideon Hayes finally understood what he'd been searching for in 15 years of drifting. Not escape from pain, but something worth the pain. Not freedom from attachments, but attachments worth being bound to. Not a life without fear, but people worth being afraid for. He'd found his home, and he'd fight to protect it for as long as he had breath in his body. The aftermath of the raid stretched long into the evening, with men tending to wounded and women bringing water and bandages to those who needed them. Gideon sat on the church steps, while Doc Brennan cleaned the gash on his forehead and examined the bruising around his throat, Margaret hovering anxiously beside him with Ruth in her arms, and Eli strapped to her chest. "You're going to have some spectacular bruises," Brennan said, his touch gentle but thorough. "And this cut will need stitches. But you'll live, which is more than can be said for some." His voice grew heavy. "We lost 3 men today. Good men with families." The weight of that settled over Gideon like a shroud. He'd seen the bodies being carried to the undertakers, had recognized 2 of them as men who'd stood at the barricades beside him just hours ago. The victory suddenly felt hollow, tainted by the price paid for it. "Who?" Margaret asked quietly. "Tom Jacobson from the general store, Frank Miller, Sarah's husband, and young Billy Watts, one of Carlyle's deputies." Brennan finished stitching Gideon's forehead and sat back. "There'll be funerals tomorrow. The whole town will turn out." Sarah Miller. Gideon's stomach clenched as he remembered her crying happy tears at his wedding just days ago, remembered her bringing flowers for Margaret's hair. Now she was a widow, and the man who'd wanted to adopt Ruth had died defending the town that might have become their daughter's home. "I need to see her," Margaret said, her voice thick with grief. "Sarah shouldn't be alone right now." "Go," Gideon told her. "I'll take the babies home, get them settled. You do what needs doing." Margaret kissed his cheek, careful of his injuries, and handed Ruth to him before hurrying off toward the Miller house. Gideon sat there on the church steps with both babies in his arms, watching the sun set over a town that had been forever changed by violence. Ruth was fussing, picking up on the tension and fear that still hung in the air. Eli just watched everything with those solemn eyes, as if bearing witness to the cost of safety. Sheriff Carlisle approached, moving stiffly from his own collection of bruises and scrapes. He lowered himself onto the step beside Gideon with a groan. "Hell of a day," he said. "Yeah." Gideon adjusted his hold on Ruth, rocking her gently. "You get a count of their dead?" 7 killed, 5 wounded and captured. The rest scattered to the wind. Carlisle's voice was grim. "The one you took down by the church, he's talking. Says they were hired by someone to hit Sweetwater specifically. Wasn't just a random raid." Gideon's blood went cold. "Hired? By who?" "Won't say, or can't, might not even know. But someone wanted this town hurt bad and they were willing to pay for it." Carlisle looked at him directly. "You made enemies recently, Hayes? Anyone who'd want to get at you through the town?" Gideon's mind raced through possibilities. He'd been a drifter for 15 years, had gotten into his share of trouble, but nothing that would warrant this kind of organized revenge. Unless it was connected to the wagon train massacre, to finding Ruth and Eli. What if the raiders who'd killed the baby's parents had tracked him here, decided to finish what they'd started? "The Red Canyon boys," Gideon said slowly. "They hit the wagon train where I found Ruth and Eli. Maybe they found out I survived, that the babies survived. Maybe they wanted to tie up loose ends. Could be. Or could be someone else entirely." Carlisle stood with another groan. "Either way, we've got prisoners to question and a town to protect. I'm doubling the night watch and keeping armed men on the streets until we know for certain the threat's past. You up for a shift?" Every muscle in Gideon's body ached and his head was pounding where Brennan had stitched it. But he looked down at Ruth and Eli, thought about Margaret out there, comforting a new widow, and knew there was only one answer. "Tell me when and where." By the time Margaret returned home well past midnight, Gideon had fed and changed both babies, put them down for the night, and was sitting at the kitchen table cleaning his guns with methodical precision. He'd learned in the war that taking care of your weapons was a kind of meditation, a way to process what you'd seen and done without falling apart. Margaret looked exhausted, her eyes red from crying, her dress stained with blood from helping tend the wounded. She stood in the doorway for a moment, just looking at him, before crossing the room and collapsing into his arms. "It was horrible," she whispered against his chest. "Sarah's destroyed. They'd been married 8 years, trying for children the whole time. Frank was her whole world, and now he's just gone. She kept asking me why. Why did he have to die? And I didn't have any answers." Gideon held her tight, feeling her shoulders shake with silent sobs. He'd comforted Sarah after the war, after their baby died, and he'd been useless then too. There were no words that made death easier, no platitudes that eased the pain of sudden loss. All you could do was be there, solid and present, while the grieving person fell apart. "I told her we'd help," Margaret said after a while, pulling back to wipe her eyes. "With the funeral costs, with the store, whatever she needs. We don't have much, but we have more than nothing, and she has less than that now." "Of course we'll help." Gideon brushed a strand of hair from her face. "That's what family does." "And Sweetwater's our family now." Margaret looked at him with something like wonder. 3 weeks ago, you were a drifter who talked to nobody. Now listen to you talking about family and community like you were born to it. 3 weeks ago, I didn't have a reason to care about community. Now I do." He glanced toward the bedroom where Ruth and Eli slept peacefully, unaware of the violence that had touched their new home. "I care about keeping them safe, about keeping you safe, about making sure what happened today doesn't happen again." "Carlisle told me what you did," Margaret said quietly. "Running after that raider, saving the church. Everyone's calling you a hero." Gideon shook his head. "I just did what needed doing. Any man would have, but they didn't. You did. You saw the danger, and you ran toward it instead of away from it." She cupped his bruised face gently. "That's who you are, Gideon Hayes. Not a drifter, not a man running from his past. A protector. A hero. Whether you want to admit it or not." He wanted to argue, but exhaustion was pulling at him like an undertow. Instead, he just pulled Margaret close again and held on, taking comfort from her solid warmth, her steady heartbeat, her presence that anchored him when everything else felt like shifting sand. They eventually made their way to bed, lying in the darkness with the babies breathing softly nearby. Gideon's mind was racing too fast for sleep, replaying the battle, seeing Frank Miller's body being carried past, feeling the raider's hands around his throat. Beside him, Margaret was equally restless, shifting and sighing. "Tell me something," she said into the darkness. "Something from before, from when you were happy." Gideon was quiet for a long moment, reaching back through years of deliberately forgotten memories. "My sister Emma, she used to make these ridiculous faces to make me laugh when I was having a bad day. She'd cross her eyes and puff out her cheeks and stick out her tongue, looking absolutely insane, until I couldn't help but laugh. Our mother would scold her for being undignified, but Emma never cared about dignity. She just cared about making people smile." He could almost see Emma's face in the darkness, hear her infectious laugh. The memory hurt, but it was a sweet hurt, like pressing on a healing bruise. "She sounds wonderful," Margaret said softly. "I wish I could have met her. She would have loved you, and she would have been crazy about Ruth and Eli." Gideon felt his throat tighten. "I used to think remembering her just made the pain worse, but tonight, thinking about her making those faces, it helped somehow. Like she's still here in a way, still making me smile even though she's been gone 15 years. Margaret found his hand in the darkness and threaded her fingers through his. "The people we love never really leave us. They live on in our memories, in the way we live our lives, in the lessons they taught us. Emma's still with you, Gideon, and so is Sarah, your first wife. They're part of who you are, part of what makes you the man I fell in love with." The casual way she said it, "fell in love with," made Gideon's heart skip. They'd said the words before, in the heat of the moment before the battle, but this felt different, more real, more permanent. "I love you too," he said, meaning it with everything he had. "I didn't think I could feel this way again, didn't think I deserved to, but you and Ruth and Eli, you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope, purpose, a reason to wake up in the morning and try to be better than I was yesterday." They made love for the first time that night, gentle and careful, and nothing like the desperate passion of young lovers, but something deeper and more meaningful. It was a promise made without words, a commitment sealed in the darkness, two damaged people choosing to be whole together. Afterward, lying tangled together with Margaret's head on his chest and her hand over his heart, Gideon finally found sleep, and for the first time in 15 years, he didn't dream of death and loss. He dreamed of mornings with crying babies and burnt coffee, of Margaret laughing at something Ruth did, of Eli taking his first steps, of a future that stretched out bright and possible before them. The funerals the next day were grim affairs, with the whole town turning out to pay respects to the fallen. Gideon stood beside Margaret, holding Ruth while Eli dozed in Margaret's arms, and watched 3 coffins being lowered into the ground. Sarah Miller stood at her husband's grave like a statue, her face blank with shock, her sister supporting her on one side and Mrs. Patterson on the other. Reverend Michaels spoke about sacrifice and duty, about men who'd given their lives defending their homes and families. But Gideon barely heard the words. He was thinking about Frank Miller, who'd never get to see his children grow up because they'd never been born. About Tom Jacobson, whose general store would pass to his sons now. About young Billy Watts, barely 20 years old, his whole life ahead of him until a raider's bullet cut it short. After the service, people gathered at the church for food and remembrance. Margaret moved through the crowd with practiced ease, offering comfort and practical help, promising to check on widows and organize meals. Gideon tried to help but found himself overwhelmed by the sheer number of people wanting to shake his hand, to thank him for his bravery, to tell him he was a credit to the badge he wore. He finally escaped to the churchyard, needing air and quiet. He was standing under a cottonwood tree, Ruth asleep against his shoulder, when Sarah Miller approached. "Mr. Hayes," she said quietly. Her voice was hoarse from crying, her eyes swollen and red. "I wanted to thank you for defending the church." Frank's last words to me before he went to fight were about keeping our family safe. "You helped him do that." Gideon didn't know what to say. How did you respond to gratitude from a woman whose husband had died in the same battle where you'd survived? I'm so sorry for your loss, Mrs. Miller. Frank was a brave man. He was. Sarah looked at Ruth, sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the grief surrounding her. I remember when you first came to town with these babies. Frank and we talked about maybe adopting one of them, trying to build the family we couldn't have naturally. Her voice broke. Now that'll never happen. I know it doesn't help, Gideon said carefully, but Frank's sacrifice saved a lot of people, including these two. They're alive because men like your husband were willing to stand and fight. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Patterson says you and Margaret are keeping them, the babies, raising them as your own. That's the plan, yes. Good. That's good. She wiped her eyes. They need parents who love them, who'll protect them. After what you did yesterday, I'd say they have that. She reached out and gently touched Ruth's small hand. Take care of them, Mr. Hayes. Don't let them forget that good people died so they could grow up safe. I won't. I promise. Sarah walked away, back to her sister and the other mourners, and Gideon stood there feeling the weight of that promise settle over him. Ruth and Eli would grow up in a town built on sacrifice, defended by people who'd chosen to fight instead of flee. They'd never remember this day, never know the names of the men who'd died protecting them. But Gideon would remember, and somehow, someday, he'd make sure they understood the price that had been paid for their safety. The week following the funerals was tense, with armed men patrolling the streets day and night and people jumping at unexpected sounds. Sheriff Carlisle kept questioning the captured raiders, trying to determine who'd hired them and whether more attacks were coming. The raiders who'd escaped were still out there somewhere, potentially regrouping for another assault. Gideon threw himself into his deputy duties with almost desperate focus, working double shifts and volunteering for the most dangerous patrols. Margaret worried about him, but she understood. He was processing trauma the only way he knew how, by staying busy, by being useful, by protecting what mattered. But the nights were hard. He'd wake from nightmares about raiders breaking into their home, about finding Margaret and the babies dead like the people at the wagon train massacre. He'd have to get up and check on them, seeing Ruth and Eli sleeping peacefully before he could calm his racing heart. One night, about 10 days after the raid, he woke from a particularly vivid nightmare to find Margaret already awake, watching him in the moonlight streaming through their window. You were shouting, she said softly, calling out warnings, telling someone to run. Sorry, I didn't mean to wake you. Don't apologize. I know what bad dreams feel like. She moved closer, resting her head on his shoulder. Do you want to talk about it? Gideon was quiet for a long moment, then found himself talking about the war, about Shiloh, where he'd taken the bullet that had kept him from getting home before Sarah died, about the field hospital where he'd watched men die from wounds that should have been survivable if only they'd had better supplies, better doctors, better luck, about coming home to graves instead of family, and the way that had broken something fundamental inside him. I spent 15 years running because I thought if I didn't stay in one place, didn't form attachments, I could avoid that kind of pain again, he said. But that raider's hands around my throat, feeling my life slipping away. All I could think was that I hadn't told you and the babies goodbye, that I'd break my promise to come back, and I realized that running hadn't protected me from pain at all. It had just made me lonely. Margaret took his hand and pressed it against her heart. You feel that? I'm alive. I'm here. And so are Ruth and Eli. We're all safe because of what you did, because of the choice you made to stay and fight instead of running. But what if next time? There's always a next time, Gideon. Always another danger, another threat, another reason to be afraid. We can't live our lives paralyzed by what might happen. All we can do is love each other fiercely and make every day count. She turned his face toward hers. I know you're scared, so am I. But I'd rather have one real day with you than a lifetime of safety without you. Her words broke something loose in him, and Gideon found himself crying, really crying, not just stoic man tears, but the kind of soul-deep weeping he'd been holding back for 15 years. He cried for Sarah and the baby they'd lost, for Emma and her ridiculous faces, for all the lonely years spent drifting, for Frank Miller and the other good men who'd died in the raid. And Margaret just held him,
her hands gentle in his hair, her presence a steady anchor while he fell apart. Ruth woke, disturbed by the crying, and her own wails joined Gideon's. Then Eli started, and suddenly their small bedroom was full of tears and grief and release. Margaret gathered Ruth while Gideon took Eli, and they sat together in the moonlight, a family processing trauma together, not hiding it or running from it, but facing it head on. "We're going to be okay," Margaret said when the crying had finally subsided, and all that remained was exhaustion and a strange sense of peace. "Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. We'll heal, we'll grow, we'll build something beautiful out of all this pain." And looking at her face in the moonlight, at Ruth's trusting eyes and Eli's solemn expression, Gideon believed her. 2 weeks after the raid, Sheriff Carlisle finally got the breakthrough he needed. One of the captured raiders, facing a hanging, decided cooperation was preferable to a rope and told them everything. The Red Canyon boys had indeed been hired to hit Sweetwater specifically, but not by other raiders. By Harold Henderson. The revelation hit the town like a thunderbolt. Henderson, the respectable merchant who'd wanted to adopt Ruth and Eli, had hired murderers to attack his own community. The motive, according to the raider, was revenge. Henderson had been furious when Gideon and Margaret chose to keep the babies instead of selling them to him. In his twisted logic, if he couldn't have the perfect family he wanted, then no one would be safe or happy in Sweetwater. Carlisle arrested Henderson at his store, in front of his horrified wife and a gathering crowd. Henderson protested his innocence loudly, claiming the raider was lying, but Caroline Henderson's face told a different story. She'd known, or at least suspected, what her husband was capable of. The trial was swift, the evidence damning. Henderson was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to hang. His wife, cleared of any involvement, sold the store and left town in disgrace. The whole ugly affair left Sweetwater shaken, wondering how they'd miss the darkness living among them. Gideon attended the hanging because Carlisle asked him to, because the deputy who'd nearly been killed defending the church deserved to see justice done. He stood in the crowd with Margaret beside him, the babies mercifully left at home with Mrs. Patterson, and watched Harold Henderson climb the scaffold stairs. Henderson's eyes found Gideon in the crowd, and for a moment their gazes locked. In Henderson's face, Gideon saw not remorse but rage, pure, impotent fury at a world that hadn't given him what he wanted. "You think you've won," Henderson called out, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "You think you've got your happy family, your perfect life. But you're living on borrowed time, Hayes. Men like you don't get happy endings." "Maybe not," Gideon called back. "But at least I don't get a rope." The hangman placed the noose, and moments later Harold Henderson was gone, his crimes paid for with the same kind of violence he'd inflicted on others. The crowd dispersed quietly, soberly, justice served, but no one feeling particularly victorious. Walking home afterward, Margaret was quiet and pensive. "He was right about one thing," she finally said. "We are living on borrowed time. Everyone is. Life's too short and too fragile to waste on fear and regret." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we should live, Gideon. Really live. Not just survive, not just get through each day, but actually embrace what we have. These babies, this town, each other. We've been given a gift. Let's not waste it being afraid." That night they made plans, real plans, for a future that extended beyond next week or next month. They'd need a bigger house eventually, when Ruth and Eli started walking and needed more space. Gideon's deputy salary was modest but steady, and Margaret's midwifery brought in additional income. They could save, could build something solid. "I want them to go to school," Margaret said, sitting at their small table with paper and pencil, figuring expenses. A real education, not just what they can pick up from whoever's available to teach. "Sweetwater's getting a proper schoolhouse next year," Gideon said. "Carlisle told me. Town council approved the funds. And I want them to know about their birth parents, their mother who died protecting them. We should try to find out who they were, see if there's any other family out there." That was something Gideon had been avoiding thinking about, the possibility that Ruth and Eli might have relatives somewhere who'd want them. But Margaret was right. The children deserved to know their history, even if it was painful. "I'll write to territorial authorities," he said. "See if anyone's filed missing persons reports, if there's any information about that wagon train.
Maybe we can at least learn their full names, where they were headed. Over the next few weeks, life slowly returned to normal. The increased patrols were scaled back. People stopped jumping at shadows. Sweetwater began to heal from the trauma of the raid, though the scars would always remain. Gideon found himself settling into his role as deputy with unexpected ease. The work suited him, protecting people, maintaining order, being part of something larger than himself. Sheriff Carlisle became not just a boss, but a mentor and friend, teaching him the fine points of frontier law enforcement. Margaret's midwifery practice grew as word spread of her skill and compassion. She delivered 3 babies that month, all healthy, all thriving. The joy on new parents' faces seemed to wash away some of the grief she'd absorbed from Sarah Miller and the other widows. And Ruth and Eli continued to grow, hitting new milestones that filled Gideon and Margaret with almost absurd levels of pride. Ruth rolled over for the first time, then discovered her toes and became fascinated with them. Eli started making more sounds, not quite words, but definitely communication attempts. Both babies smiled more, laughed at silly faces, reached for Gideon and Margaret with obvious recognition and affection. One evening in late autumn, with winter's first snow just beginning to dust the mountains visible from their porch, Gideon sat outside watching the sunset while Ruth practiced her rolling on a blanket at his feet. Margaret emerged with Eli and 2 cups of coffee, settling into the chair beside him. "Sarah Miller stopped by today," she said. "She's been having a hard time, as you'd expect, but she said something that stuck with me." "What's that?" "She said watching us with Ruth and Eli gives her hope, that love and family can survive anything, even tragedy, that there's still goodness in the world worth fighting for." Margaret looked at him over her coffee cup. "You gave her that, Gideon, by choosing to stay, to fight, to build this life. You showed her that endings aren't always tragic, that sometimes broken people find ways to heal." Gideon thought about the man he'd been 3 months ago, drifting through the desert with nothing but a horse and a gun and a reputation for solitude. That man wouldn't recognize the life he was living now, settled, domestic, responsible for 3 other people who depended on him for everything, but he wouldn't go back to that lonely existence for anything, not for all the freedom in the world. "You know what's funny?" he said. "I spent 15 years thinking I was free. No ties, no obligations, no one to answer to. But I wasn't free at all. I was trapped by fear, by grief, by the belief that caring about people would only lead to more pain." He reached over and took Margaret's hand. "You freed me. You and these babies. You showed me that the opposite of loss isn't isolation, it's connection. You have to risk your heart to feel alive." Ruth chose that moment to roll right off her blanket into the dirt, bumping her head lightly. She looked surprised for a second, then her face crumpled and she began to wail. Gideon scooped her up immediately, checking for injury, finding none, just a startled baby who needed comfort. "You're okay, little bit," he murmured, rocking her gently. "Just a bump. Nothing a little love can't fix." The words felt prophetic somehow. Just a bump. Nothing love can't fix. It was the philosophy they'd been living by without naming it. The belief that whatever challenges came, whatever obstacles they faced, love and commitment could see them through. 3 months ago, Gideon Hayes had been a man with nothing to live for. Now he had everything. A wife he adored, 2 children he'd fight heaven and hell to protect, a community that respected him, and a purpose that got him up each morning with something resembling enthusiasm. "I got a letter today," Margaret said after Ruth had calmed and was contentedly chewing on her own fist. "From the territorial office, in response to your inquiry about the wagon train." Gideon's stomach tightened. "And?" "They found records. The wagon train was registered to a family named Morrison, James and Ellen Morrison, along with their infant twins Ruth and Eli. They were heading to California, planning to start a farm in the Sacramento Valley." Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. "There's no other family. Ellen was an orphan, and James's parents died years ago. No siblings on either side. Ruth and Eli are truly alone except for us." Part of Gideon felt guilty for the relief that washed through him. He didn't want these children to be orphans, didn't want them to have lost everything. But the selfish part of him was glad there was no one to take them away, no distant relative with a better claim to their hearts. "Morrison," he repeated, testing the name. "Ruth and Eli Morrison." "Or Ruth and Eli Hayes," Margaret said quietly.
We could adopt them formally, make it legal and permanent, give them our name. The magnitude of that offer took Gideon's breath away. These babies who'd started as strangers, as desperate survivors of a massacre, could become his children, not just in practice but in law, in name, in every way that mattered. "Ruth Hayes," he said, looking down at the baby in his arms. She gazed back at him with those knowing eyes, and he could have sworn she understood the significance of the moment. "Eli Hayes." "Our daughter," Margaret said, smiling at Ruth. "Our son." She looked at Eli, who was beginning to doze against her shoulder. "Our family." That night, after the babies were asleep and the house was quiet, Gideon and Margaret sat together making more plans. They talked to Reverend Michaels about a formal adoption ceremony. They'd file the proper paperwork with the territorial court. They'd make Ruth and Eli Hayes official in every sense. "You know what this means, don't you?" Margaret said, her eyes sparkling with mischief and joy. "You're not a drifter anymore. You're a father, a husband, a deputy, and a permanent resident of Sweetwater Creek. You're as settled gets." "Good," Gideon said, pulling her close. "I'm done drifting. I'm done running. This is where I belong, right here, with you, with them, building something that'll outlast us all." And as he lay in bed that night, listening to Ruth's soft snoring and Eli's gentle breathing, feeling Margaret's warmth beside him, Gideon Hayes felt something he'd never expected to feel again. Contentment. Not the absence of problems or fear, but the deep-boned certainty that whatever came, he could face it. Because he wasn't alone anymore. He had his family, he had his home, and he had the rest of his life to prove that broken men could heal, that drifters could settle, and that love, messy, complicated, hard-won love, was worth every risk, every fear, every moment of doubt. Outside, snow began to fall in earnest, covering Sweetwater in a blanket of white. Winter was coming, with all its challenges and hardships. But inside the small house at the edge of town, warmth and love kept the cold at bay. And in the darkness, 4 people who'd started as strangers had become what they were always meant to be. A family, forged through fire and bound by choice, ready to face whatever tomorrow brought together. Winter descended on Sweetwater with a fury that caught even the old-timers by surprise. Snow piled 3 feet deep in the streets, and temperatures plummeted so low that water froze solid in the pump overnight. Margaret's small house, never built for a harsh winter or a family of 4, struggled to keep them warm despite Gideon's best efforts to seal cracks and keep the stove burning constantly. Ruth developed a cough that had Margaret up all night administering steam treatments and willow bark tea. Eli seemed impervious to the cold but fussed endlessly, his teeth coming in with a vengeance that made him irritable and prone to tears. Between his deputy duties and caring for sick children, Gideon was running on maybe 3 hours of sleep a night, his exhaustion showing in the dark circles under his eyes, and the way he sometimes forgot what he was saying mid-sentence. "This isn't sustainable," Margaret said one morning after a particularly brutal night where Ruth's coughing had kept everyone awake. She was mixing oatmeal with one hand while bouncing Eli on her hip with the other, her hair escaping its bun and her face drawn with fatigue. "We need more space, better insulation, a separate room for the children. This house was fine for me alone, but for 4 people. "I know." Gideon was changing Ruth, who'd finally fallen into an exhausted sleep around dawn. Her breathing was easier today, the steam treatments working, but she still felt too warm under his hands. "I've been saving every penny from my deputy pay. Maybe by spring we'll have enough for something bigger." "Spring's 4 months away," Margaret pointed out. "We need something now." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Gideon opened it to find Sheriff Carlisle standing on the porch, stamping snow from his boots, his breath misting in the frigid air. "Morning, Hayes. Got a minute?" They stepped outside so they wouldn't wake Ruth, and Carlisle got straight to the point. "The old Patterson place, the house behind the cafe where Mrs. Patterson's son used to live before he moved to Denver, it's been sitting empty for 2 years. She's offered to rent it to you and Margaret for $1 a month until you can afford to buy it outright." Gideon stared at him, certain he'd misheard. $1 a month? "That's what I said. She's seen how you're struggling in that little house, how hard you're working to provide for your family. She wants to help." Carlisle's weathered face creased in a smile.
That woman's got a heart bigger than the territory, and she's decided your family is worth investing in. I'd take the offer if I were you, before she changes her mind. The Patterson house was everything their current home wasn't. Spacious, well-built, with separate bedrooms and a kitchen large enough to actually move around in. It had a big stove, a root cellar, and best of all, a nursery on the second floor with windows that caught the morning sun. When Mrs. Patterson showed them through later that day, Margaret actually cried at the sight of the nursery. "My son built this room for his children," Mrs. Patterson said softly, running her hand along the sturdy crib that still stood in the corner. But his wife couldn't have babies, and they decided to move to the city for better opportunities. It's been empty ever since, just waiting for children's laughter to fill it again. She looked at Ruth, sleeping in Gideon's arms, and Eli, wide-eyed and curious in Margaret's. "These babies need a proper home, and you two need a place where you can grow your family without tripping over each other." "We can't possibly accept such generosity," Margaret protested, but her eyes were already measuring curtains and planning furniture arrangement. $1 a month is fair payment for keeping the house maintained and lived in instead of letting it rot empty, Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "Besides, you'll be doing me a favor. Having you close by means I can pop over and steal baby cuddles whenever I want. Win-win situation." They moved in a week later, with what seemed like half of Sweetwater turning out to help carry furniture and supplies through the snow. Sarah Miller brought curtains she'd sewn herself, beautiful work that must have taken hours. Doc Brennan contributed a medical kit specifically for children, with tonics and ointments for common ailments. Even Sheriff Carlisle showed up with his sons, hauling Gideon and Margaret's meager belongings across town and helping set up the new house. By evening, they were settled in a way that felt almost miraculous. Ruth and Eli had the nursery, with the sturdy crib for Eli and a smaller one that the carpenter had donated for Ruth. The room was warm, bright, and safe. Everything Gideon had wanted for them, but hadn't dared hope they'd actually have. Margaret stood in the doorway of the nursery, watching the babies sleep in their separate cribs, and Gideon came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "We have a real home," she whispered, as if afraid saying it too loud would break the spell. "A real proper home for our family." Thanks to Mrs. Patterson and the rest of this town, Gideon rested his chin on top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair and feeling the rightness of the moment settle into his bones. "I don't know what we did to deserve this kind of kindness. You saved those babies. You fought for this town. You showed up and stayed when most men would have kept drifting." Margaret turned in his arms to face him. "Sweetwater takes care of its own, and like it or not, you're one of ours now. We don't let our people struggle alone." That night, sleeping in their own bedroom with the babies safely tucked into their nursery and winter howling outside their solid walls, Gideon felt something shift inside him. For 15 years, he'd believed he was meant to be alone, that his penance for surviving when Sarah and Emma hadn't was a life of solitary wandering. But Sweetwater had shown him a different truth, that redemption didn't come through isolation, but through connection, through showing up and being present and letting people help carry the weight. The adoption ceremony took place on a surprisingly mild day in January, with the whole town turning out to witness Ruth and Eli officially become Ruth Hayes and Eli Hayes. Reverend Michaels performed the ceremony in the church, with Ruth wearing a white dress that Mrs. Patterson had made, and Eli in a tiny suit that made him look absurdly formal and adorable. "Do you, Gideon Hayes and Margaret Hayes, promise to love, protect, and raise these children as your own, providing for their physical, emotional, and spiritual needs to the best of your abilities?" Reverend Michaels asked. "We do," they said in unison, Gideon's voice rough with emotion and Margaret's eyes bright with tears. "And do you promise to tell them of their birth parents' sacrifice, to honor the memory of James and Ellen Morrison, and to ensure these children know they were loved from the very beginning?" "We do," they said again, and Gideon felt the weight of that promise settle over him like a sacred vow. "Then by the authority vested in me by the territory of New Mexico, I declare Ruth Morrison and Eli Morrison to be legally and forever the children of Gideon and Margaret Hayes. May God bless this family and keep them in his care." The church erupted in applause, and people surged forward to congratulate them and coo over the babies. Ruth, startled by all the noise and attention, began to cry. Gideon scooped her up immediately, and her cries subsided as soon as she recognized him, her small fists clutching his shirt.
"That's my girl," he murmured. "You're safe. Papa's got you." Papa. The word felt strange on his tongue, foreign and wonderful all at once. He was somebody's papa now, officially and legally. These weren't just babies he was caring for temporarily. They were his children, his to raise and protect and love for the rest of his life. Margaret was crying openly now, happy tears streaming down her face as she held Eli and accepted congratulations. When their eyes met across the crowd, Gideon saw his own joy and terror reflected back at him. They were parents now, real parents, with all the responsibility and fear and overwhelming love that entailed. The celebration afterward was joyous and loud, with food and music and more goodwill than Gideon knew how to process. But the moment that stuck with him came later, when the crowd had thinned and he found Sarah Miller standing alone near the Morrison parents' memorial stone they'd erected in the churchyard. "Mrs. Miller," Gideon said softly, not wanting to intrude on her grief but unable to walk past without acknowledging her. "Mr. Hayes." She turned to him with a smile that was sad but genuine. "Or should I say, congratulations to the new father?" "Thank you. And please, call me Gideon." She nodded, then looked back at the memorial stone. "I've been thinking a lot about Frank lately, about the life we could have had, the children we wanted. It's hard not to be bitter, not to rage at God for taking him." She paused. "But then I see you with Ruth and Eli, and I think maybe there's a plan in all this chaos. Maybe Frank died so those babies could live. Maybe his sacrifice meant something." "It meant everything," Gideon said firmly. "Those children are alive because your husband and others like him stood between them and evil. That's not nothing, Sarah. That's heroism." "I know. It just doesn't make missing him any easier." She wiped her eyes. "But I wanted you to know, seeing your family gives me hope. It reminds me that life continues, that love persists even after loss. So thank you for that, for showing us all that broken things can be mended." After she walked away, Gideon stood for a long moment looking at the memorial stone, reading the names carved there. James Morrison, Ellen Morrison, parents who'd died protecting their children, who'd given everything so Ruth and Eli might live. He would make sure their sacrifice wasn't forgotten, that their children knew where they came from and understood the price that had been paid for their survival. Winter continued its harsh grip on Sweetwater, but inside the Patterson house, the Hayes family was warm and thriving. Ruth's cough finally cleared up completely, and she began to show the first signs of real personality, stubborn, curious, with a laugh that could light up a room. Eli remained the quieter twin, but his smiles were frequent now, and he'd begun to recognize his name, turning his head when called. Gideon settled into fatherhood with surprising ease, though he constantly worried he was doing everything wrong. Margaret would find him sometimes at night, standing over the cribs just watching the babies sleep, making sure they were still breathing, still safe. "They're fine," she'd tell him gently. "You can't protect them from everything." "I can try," he'd reply, and she'd smile and lead him back to bed, where they'd lie tangled together and talk about their fears and hopes in whispered voices. One particularly cold February night, Gideon was on patrol with Sheriff Carlisle when they came across a wagon broken down on the outskirts of town. A family huddled inside, mother, father, and 3 children, all half frozen and desperate. "We're trying to reach California," the father explained through chattering teeth. "But we got caught in that last storm. Lost most of our supplies. Wagon wheel broke, and I don't have the tools to fix it." Gideon looked at this family, tired, scared, at the mercy of elements and circumstance, and saw himself 3 months ago carrying 2 dying babies through the desert with no clear destination. He saw the wagon train where he'd found Ruth and Eli, saw all the ways desperation and bad luck could end in tragedy. "Carlisle," he said quietly, "we need to help them." The sheriff nodded. "Already planning on it. Let's get them to the church, get them warm and fed. We can work on the wagon tomorrow." They spent the next hour getting the family settled, with Margaret appearing to tend to the children's frostbite and Mrs. Patterson organizing food and blankets. The parents kept thanking them, overwhelmed by the generosity of strangers, and Gideon thought about how he'd once been on the receiving end of that same generosity.
This is what community means, Margaret told him later as they walked home through the snow. Taking care of each other, seeing someone in need and helping, no questions asked. That's what Sweetwater gave us. And now we pass it forward. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it a sense of renewal and possibility. The snow melted, revealing muddy streets and the first green shoots of new growth. Birds returned to the cottonwoods. The whole town seemed to emerge from its winter hibernation with renewed energy. Ruth and Eli were growing fast, both approaching their first birthday. Ruth had started pulling herself up on furniture, determined to walk even though her legs weren't quite ready. Eli was content to sit and observe, his dark eyes tracking everything with that same intense awareness he'd had since infancy. He's going to be the thinker, Margaret predicted, watching Eli study a wooden block like it held the secrets of the universe. And she's going to be the doer. They'll balance each other out. Gideon was carving a rocking horse for their birthday when Sheriff Carlisle appeared at his workshop behind the house, his face grave. "We got word from the territorial marshal," Carlisle said without preamble. "They caught the rest of the Red Canyon boys, tracked them all the way to Arizona territory. They're being brought back to face trial for the wagon train massacre." Gideon's hands stilled on the wood. "When?" "Trial's set for next month. They'll need you to testify about finding the babies, about the condition of the massacre site, about the men you saw return to it." Carlisle paused. "It'll mean traveling to Santa Fe, probably being gone for a week or more." "I know that's hard with young children, but I'll do it," Gideon said immediately. "Those babies' parents deserve justice. James and Ellen Morrison deserve to be remembered, and their killers deserve to hang." Margaret was less enthusiastic when he told her that evening. "A week? Gideon, the children are barely a year old. Ruth's teething. Eli's been fussy. I can manage, but—" "Come with me," Gideon said suddenly. "All of you. We'll make it an adventure. The children are old enough to travel now, and Santa Fe's not so far. A week there and back, and we'll see justice done together." So in late April, the Hayes family set out for Santa Fe in a borrowed wagon, with supplies for the journey and two babies who seemed to think traveling was the greatest adventure ever conceived. Ruth babbled constantly, pointing at everything they passed and demanding to know what it was. Eli was quieter but equally fascinated, his eyes wide as he took in the changing landscape. They camped under the stars, with Margaret teaching Gideon how to entertain babies while cooking over an open fire. They sang songs and told stories and played silly games that made the children laugh. And at night, after Ruth and Eli were asleep, Gideon and Margaret would lie together, looking up at the vast New Mexico sky and marveling at how far they'd come. "A year ago, I was alone," Gideon said one night, his arm around Margaret and her head on his chest. "Completely, utterly alone. And now look at us. A family. Traveling together, building a life. Sometimes I can't believe this is real." "It's real," Margaret assured him. "The good and the bad, the joy and the fear, all of it's real. And all of it's ours." The trial in Santa Fe was brutal. Gideon had to recount finding the massacre site, describing in detail the bodies and the violence and the two tiny survivors hidden beneath their mother's corpse. He had to identify the men he'd seen return to the site, had to explain how he'd hidden with the babies while murderers walked past just feet away. The defense attorney tried to discredit him, suggesting he'd made up details or exaggerated the violence. But Gideon's testimony was too clear, too specific, backed up by physical evidence and the statements of other witnesses. And when Margaret took the stand to describe the condition of the babies when she'd found them, malnourished, dehydrated, clinging to life, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. The Red Canyon boys were convicted on all counts. All 7 surviving members were sentenced to hang. Justice finally served for James and Ellen Morrison and the 6 other people who died in that desert canyon. After the verdict, the territorial judge called Gideon and Margaret to his chambers. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes, I wanted to personally thank you for your testimony and for what you did for those children. The Morrison family has no living relatives to speak for them, but if they did, I imagine they'd be grateful beyond measure that their children ended up with people like you." "We're the grateful ones, Your Honor," Margaret said softly. "Ruth and Eli saved us just as much as we saved them." On the journey home, they stopped at a small trading post to rest and resupply. While Margaret was inside purchasing goods, Gideon sat on the porch with the babies, letting them play in a patch of sunshine. An old woman approached, her face weathered and kind, and asked to see the children. "Beautiful babies," she said, watching Ruth try to eat her own foot while Eli solemnly studied a pebble. "They're blessed to have a father who looks at them like you do." "I'm the blessed one," Gideon replied. The woman smiled. "That's how you know you're doing it right. When you understand that children are gifts, not burdens. When you see them as blessings instead of obligations." She patted his hand. "Your wife is right to love you, and those babies are lucky to call you Papa." The simple words stayed with Gideon long after the woman had gone. Lucky to call you Papa? For so long he'd felt like he was the lucky one, like he'd stumbled into this family by accident and they'd let him stay out of pity or convenience. But maybe that wasn't true. Maybe he'd earned his place here, through love and sacrifice and showing up every day even when it was hard. They arrived back in Sweetwater on a warm May evening, with the sun setting gold over the mountains and the town looking like something out of a painting. People came out to greet them, asking about the trial and cooing over how much the babies had grown in just a week. Mrs. Patterson had prepared a welcome home dinner, and they ate surrounded by friends and neighbors who'd become family. Ruth charmed everyone by actually taking her first wobbly steps, stumbling from Gideon's arms to Margaret's amid cheers and applause. Eli watched his sister's triumph and clapped his small hands together, his solemn face breaking into a rare, brilliant smile. That night, putting the children to bed in their nursery, Gideon felt a profound sense of completion. The men who'd killed James and Ellen Morrison would hang. The babies those parents had died protecting were safe and loved and thriving. Justice had been served, mercy had been given, and somehow, out of tragedy and loss, something beautiful had been built. "Thank you," he whispered to Ruth and Eli as he tucked them in, knowing they wouldn't understand but needing to say it anyway. "Thank you for trusting me, for needing me, for giving me a reason to stop running and start living." Ruth yawned and snuggled into her blanket. Eli watched him with those knowing eyes, and Gideon could have sworn the baby understood every word. Summer arrived with warmth and growth, and the Hayes family flourished along with the rest of Sweetwater. Gideon took on more responsibilities with the sheriff's department, becoming Carlisle's right-hand man and eventually his designated successor when the old sheriff announced his retirement. Margaret's midwifery practice expanded, and she began training a young apprentice who'd come to town looking for purpose. Ruth and Eli celebrated their first birthday with a party that seemed to involve half of Sweetwater. They smashed cake into their faces and laughed at everything and looked so happy that Gideon had to step away for a moment to compose himself. Margaret found him behind the house, wiping his eyes. "Hey," she said softly, taking his hand. "You okay?" "Yeah, just a year ago I was carrying 2 dying babies through a storm, not knowing if we'd survive the night. And now look at them. Look at us. It's overwhelming sometimes. How much can change in such a short time?" "Good change, though," Margaret said, smiling. "The best kind of change." "The best kind," Gideon agreed. As summer faded into autumn and then winter again, the Hayes family continued to grow and evolve. Ruth became more fearless and adventurous, constantly getting into things she shouldn't and keeping her parents on their toes. Eli remained quieter but developed a mischievous streak, often setting up his sister for trouble and watching with innocent eyes as she got caught. "They're partners in crime already," Gideon observed one day after finding both children covered in flour from a bag they'd somehow accessed in the pantry. "We're in trouble when they get older." "We're in trouble now," Margaret laughed, trying to clean flour out of Eli's hair. "But I wouldn't change it for anything." On a cold December evening, almost exactly a year after they'd moved into the Patterson house, Gideon came home from patrol to find Margaret sitting by the fire with an odd expression on her face, part nervous, part excited, part terrified. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, scanning for signs of trouble. "Nothing's wrong. I have news." She took a breath. "Gideon, I'm pregnant. We're going to have another baby." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Another baby. Not adopted, not found in a massacre site, but theirs, made together, grown together, a child who would share both their names and their blood. "Are you sure?" he managed. "Doc Brennan confirmed it this afternoon. I'm about 3 months along. The baby should come next June."
Her eyes searched his face anxiously. "Are you happy? I know we didn't plan this, and money's still tight, and the house will be even more crowded." Gideon crossed to her in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, kissing her thoroughly. Happy doesn't begin to cover it. Terrified, overwhelmed, ecstatic, all of those and more. "We're having a baby, Margaret. Our baby." She laughed and cried at the same time, and they held each other while the fire crackled and Ruth and Eli played obliviously nearby, unaware that their family was about to expand again. That night, lying in bed with Margaret's hand on her still flat stomach, Gideon thought about the strange and beautiful path that had led him here. If he hadn't stopped at that wagon train, if he hadn't found Ruth and Eli, if Margaret hadn't appeared in that canyon, any number of small choices could have led to a completely different life. But all those choices had brought him here, to this moment, to this family that felt like destiny and miracle combined. "You know what I was thinking?" Margaret said softly in the darkness. "We should tell Ruth and Eli about their birth parents when they're old enough to understand. Not just that they died, but who they were. That their mother loved them enough to use her body as a shield. That their father probably died trying to protect them. They should know they come from courage and sacrifice." "And we'll tell them about the men who saved them," Gideon added. "Sheriff Carlisle, who offered work and friendship. Mrs. Patterson, who gave us a home. Sarah Miller, who donated curtains even while grieving her husband. All the people who showed up and helped when we needed it most. We'll tell them they're part of something bigger than just one family," Margaret agreed. "Part of a community that protects its own and lifts up the fallen and believes in second chances." "And third chances," Gideon said. "And fourth, however many chances it takes." The winter passed with its usual challenges, but the knowledge of new life growing made even the coldest days feel warm with possibility. Ruth and Eli continued to thrive, hitting new milestones and developing distinct personalities that never ceased to amaze their parents. By spring, Ruth was running everywhere and Eli was finally starting to walk, his careful steps a contrast to his sister's reckless charging. Margaret's pregnancy progressed smoothly, her body adapting to the changes with the same grace she brought to everything else. Gideon found himself constantly amazed by her strength, her competence, the way she could deliver someone else's baby in the morning and then come home to care for their own children without missing a beat. "You're staring again," she'd tell him, catching his gaze across the dinner table. "Can't help it. You're extraordinary." "I'm pregnant and exhausted, and I probably have spit up in my hair," she'd reply. But she'd smile. That special smile that was just for him, and Gideon would fall in love with her all over again. The baby, a daughter they named Emma, after Gideon's sister, arrived on a warm June evening, delivered by Doc Brennan while Mrs. Patterson watched Ruth and Eli and Gideon pace the floor downstairs like every nervous father since the beginning of time. When Brennan finally called him up to meet his daughter, Gideon took the stairs 3 at a time. Margaret looked exhausted but radiant, cradling a tiny bundle wrapped in white. "Come meet your daughter," she said, and Gideon approached with shaking legs. Emma Hayes was perfect, tiny and pink and perfect, with a tuft of dark hair and Margaret's nose, and a cry that was surprisingly loud for something so small. When Gideon took her in his arms for the first time, he felt the same overwhelming surge of love and terror he'd felt with Ruth and Eli, but different too. This was his daughter, his and Margaret's, proof that broken people could create beautiful things, that lives built on second chances could flourish and grow. "Hello, Emma," he whispered. "I'm your papa, and I promise you I'm going to spend every day of my life making sure you know you're loved." Ruth and Eli met their baby sister the next morning, with Ruth immediately trying to climb into Margaret's lap to get a better look, and Eli hanging back shyly until Gideon lifted him up to see. Both toddlers seemed fascinated by the tiny newcomer, Ruth patting Emma's head gently, while Eli just stared with his usual intense concentration. "Baby," Ruth announced proudly, testing out the new word. "That's right, sweet girl. This is your baby sister, Emma. We're going to help take care of her, okay?" Over the next few weeks, the Hayes household adjusted to life with 3 children under the age of 2. It was chaos and exhaustion and more work than Gideon had imagined possible. But it was also joy and laughter and moments of pure magic, like when Ruth brought Emma her favorite blanket unprompted, or when Eli sang one of his wordless songs to soothe the baby's crying,
or when Gideon woke at 3 in the morning to find Margaret nursing Emma while humming a lullaby, her face soft with love in the lamplight. One evening in late summer, with Emma sleeping in her cradle and Ruth and Eli playing on the floor, Gideon stood at the window of their home watching the sun set over Sweetwater. Margaret came to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About how a year and a half ago I was nobody, a drifter with a gun and a horse and nothing else. And now I'm somebody's husband, somebody's father, a deputy in a town that feels like home. I have a family, a purpose, a reason to wake up in the morning." He turned to look at her. "You did that. You and those 2 babies I found in the desert. You gave me my life back." "We gave each other life," Margaret corrected gently. "I was just as lost as you were, just as lonely. We saved each other, Gideon. That's what love does. It saves us from ourselves." Behind them, Ruth let out a peal of laughter at something Eli had done. Emma stirred in her cradle but didn't wake. The house was warm, full of the sounds and smells of family. And Gideon Hayes, who'd spent 15 years believing he was meant to be alone, understood finally that he'd been wrong. He'd never been meant for solitude. He'd been meant for this, for scraped knees and midnight feedings, for laughter and tears, for a wife who understood his demons and children who gave him reasons to slay them. For a community that had taken a broken man and helped him become whole. For second chances and third chances and as many chances as it took to get life right. The following spring, on a warm April morning, the whole town gathered to dedicate a memorial in the town square. A simple stone marker with names carved deep: James Morrison, Ellen Morrison, Frank Miller, Tom Jacobson, Billy Watts, and 7 others who died in the raid. A reminder that freedom and safety came at a price, paid by people who'd chosen courage over fear. Gideon stood with Margaret and the children as Reverend Michaels blessed the memorial. Ruth, now 2.5, held his hand and asked endless questions in a loud whisper. Eli, quieter as always, leaned against Margaret's leg. And Emma, just learning to walk, toddled between them with the fearless determination of someone too young to understand danger. After the ceremony, people lingered, sharing stories about the fallen and celebrating how far the town had come. Sarah Miller approached Gideon and Margaret, her face peaceful in a way it hadn't been for months. "I wanted to thank you," she said, "for keeping Frank's memory alive, for helping establish this memorial. It matters, knowing he won't be forgotten." "He'll never be forgotten," Gideon promised. "We'll make sure of that. And when our children are old enough to understand, we'll bring them here and tell them about the brave people who died protecting them." Sarah smiled and knelt down to Ruth's level. "Your papa is a hero. You know that? He saved you and your brother, kept you safe when the whole world was dangerous." Ruth looked up at Gideon with her mother's eyes, Ellen Morrison's eyes, and said with perfect confidence, "Papa's the best." Such simple words from a 2-year-old, but they hit Gideon with the force of a revelation. Papa's the best. Not perfect, not without flaws or fears, but the best she knew, the best he could be. And maybe that was enough. That evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Gideon and Margaret sat on their porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Emma's cradle was beside them, the baby sleeping peacefully. Inside, Ruth and Eli were dreaming whatever 2-year-olds dreamed about. "Do you ever think about where we'd be if things had gone differently?" Margaret asked. "If you'd ridden past that wagon train? If I hadn't stopped in that canyon?" "Sometimes," Gideon admitted, but not with regret. Every choice, every moment of pain or fear or doubt, they all led here, to this porch, this family, this life. I wouldn't change any of it. Not even the hard parts? Especially not the hard parts. They taught us what we were capable of, showed us we were stronger together than we ever were alone." He pulled her close. "Besides, the hard parts make the good parts better. I appreciate every peaceful moment now because I know how easily it could all be lost." They sat in comfortable silence, watching Sweetwater settle into night around them. Lamplight glowed in windows. A dog barked somewhere. A wagon rattled past on the main road. Ordinary sounds of ordinary life in an ordinary town. But there was nothing ordinary about what they'd built here. A family forged from tragedy and choice. A home created from mercy and stubbornness. a life that proved broken things could be mended, that drifters could settle, that love, messy, complicated, hard-won love, could redeem even the most lost souls. Years later, people in Sweetwater would tell the story of the cowboy who'd found 2 dying babies in the desert and refused to let them go. They'd talk about how Gideon Hayes had walked through storms and fought raiders and built a family from nothing but determination and love. They'd point out Ruth and Eli Hayes to newcomers, saying, "Those two? Their papa saved them when they were tiny babies, carried them across half the territory to keep them safe. That's the kind of man Deputy Hayes is." But the story they didn't tell, couldn't tell, because they didn't know it, was the one Gideon carried in his heart. The story of a man so broken by loss, he'd convinced himself he was better off alone. The story of a woman whose grief had driven her to constant motion, always helping others while neglecting her own need for home. The story of how 2 strangers met in a canyon and chose each other, chose family, chose hope over fear. That was the story Gideon would tell his children someday, when they were old enough to understand. He'd tell them about their birth parents' sacrifice, yes, but he'd also tell them about the choice he and Margaret had made, to love even when it was terrifying, to commit even when it was inconvenient, to show up every day and do the hard work of building something real and lasting. "You're not alone," Margaret had told him that first night in the line shack, when everything was uncertain and the future was just a question mark. She'd been right, though neither of them had fully understood it at the time. He wasn't alone. None of them were. They had each other, and they had Sweetwater. And they had a love that had been tested by fire and proven strong enough to survive anything. As the stars wheeled overhead and Emma stirred in her cradle, making soft baby sounds in her sleep, Gideon felt a peace he'd never expected to feel again. This was his life now. Not the life he'd planned, not the life he'd thought he wanted, but the life he'd been given through grace and circumstance and the stubborn refusal to give up on 2 tiny strangers who needed him. He was Papa now. Husband, deputy, friend, community member. All the roles he'd spent 15 years avoiding had become his identity, his purpose, his joy. And every morning when he woke to crying babies or toddlers jumping on the bed or his wife's smile in the early light, he gave thanks for the day in the desert when he'd made the choice to stop running and start living. The road ahead would have its challenges. Children grew up, needs changed, new crises would come. But Gideon Hayes had learned something in his journey from drifter to father. You didn't need to face the future alone. You just needed people worth facing it with and the courage to let them in. He had both now, and that made all the difference. The end.